The sun hung low over the ancient village, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to cling to the thatched roofs and worn stone pathways. For Alara, the golden light of late afternoon usually brought a sense of peace, a quiet moment to herself after a day of chores. But today, the air felt heavy, charged with an impending storm that had nothing to do with the weather. She stood in the small garden behind her family's cottage, her fingers still stained with earth from tending the herbs, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had known this moment was coming. The looks, the whispers, the way Caius, the chieftain's son, had watched her in the village square with the possessive gaze of a hunter marking his prey. He was a man carved from cruelty and privilege, his reputation built on the backs of those he'd broken. His proposal was not a question. It was a demand, a claim he believed was his right to stake. He arrived not with humility, but with an entourage, his broad frame blocking the sunlight at the garden gate. His fine tunic, embroidered with symbols of his family's status, seemed to mock the simplicity of her home. He did not smile. His expression was one of cold expectation. The words he spoke were formal, empty, a recitation of a transaction. He spoke of alliances, of strength, of the honor he was bestowing upon her and her family. But his eyes, dark and devoid of warmth, spoke of ownership. He finished and waited, his confidence a palpable force. The men behind him shifted, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords, a silent reinforcement of his power. A silence fell, thick and suffocating. Alara could feel the weight of the village's eyes upon her from behind shuttered windows. She could feel the terrified hope of her parents, who stood nervously in the doorway of their home, knowing the danger of refusal but praying for acceptance. This was the moment her life would be decided for her, the moment she would be traded for a sliver of perceived safety. But a fire, long banked within her spirit, roared to life. It was a fire fed by the memory of Caius's casual brutality, the way he had laughed as his guards rough-housed a young boy who had accidentally stumbled into his path. It was fed by her own dreams, quiet and fierce, of a life that was hers to shape. She lifted her chin, meeting his arrogant gaze without flinching. The rejection was not shouted, but it was absolute, a clear, steady stream of truth that cut through the tense air. She spoke of his nature, not with malice, but with a devastating clarity that left no room for argument. She spoke of the violence that was his currency and the fear he cultivated like a crop. And finally, she spoke of herself, her right to choose, her desire for a partnership built on respect, not fear, her unwavering claim to her own autonomy. The effect was instantaneous. Caius's smug assurance shattered, replaced by a rage so pure it seemed to bleach the color from his face. The air, once heavy, now crackled with his fury. He took a step forward, a wordless threat in the movement. But Alara stood her ground, her own resolve a shield against his wrath. He had come for a possession and had been given a defiance he could not comprehend. Without another word, he turned on his heel, his men scrambling after him, leaving behind a garden filled with the wreckage of his pride and the terrifying certainty of his vengeance. Alara stood alone, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the immense, terrifying cost of her own freedom. The door of the cottage slammed shut, the sound of violent punctuation to the silence Caius had left in his wake. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fear and crushed herbs. Illyra's father, Lorcan, stood with his back to her, his broad shoulders tense, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. The fading light from the single window caught the silver threading through his dark hair, making him look older, more worn than she had ever seen him. Her mother, Althea, hovered near the hearth, her face pale, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her apron, a silent statue of dread. Lorcan turned slowly. The disappointment in his eyes was a physical blow, but it was the terror lurking beneath it that chilled Alara to her core. He was not a cowardly man, but he was a practical one. A man who had spent a lifetime navigating the treacherous currents of the chieftain as favor to keep his family safe and fed, had seen what happened to those who stood in Caius's way. He had helped bury them. His voice, when it came, was low and strained, stripped of its usual warmth. He did not shout. The quiet intensity was far worse. He spoke of reality, of the fragile scaffolding of their lives. He painted a vivid picture of the disgrace that would now cling to their name like a rot of the neighbors who would cross the street to avoid. them of the tradesmen who would suddenly find their goods spoiled or their prices doubled. But most of all he spoke of Caius's wrath, a cold, calculating thing that would not be satisfied with mere social exile. He spoke of burned fields, of a withdrawn protection that would leave them vulnerable to bandits, of a slow, grinding destruction orchestrated from the chieftain's hall. His ultimatum was simple, desperate. She must go to the hall at first light. She must recant her words. She must accept the proposal, for her sake, for her mother's, for his. It was the only path that led to survival. His eyes begged her to understand, to be the daughter he needed her to be in that moment, compliant, sensible, safe. Alara listened, her heart a trapped bird beating against her ribs. She saw the genuine fear for her, for them all, and for a moment, the weight of it threatened to buckle her knees. She could see the future he described unfolding with terrible clarity, a gray, suffocating existence. But then she looked at her own hands, still marked with the soil of her garden, the one place where her will had always shaped the world. To recant would be to erase herself, to become a ghost in her own life, a pretty ornament in Caius's violent court. She met her father's pleading gaze, her own resolve hardening into something cold and unyielding. She shook her head, a slow final movement. She would not go. She would not apologize for wanting a life free from fear. She would not trade her soul for their security. The fracture was immediate and absolute. The fear in Lorcan's eyes curdled into something darker, bitter, helpless anger. He had offered her their only lifeline, and she had set it aflame. A terrible silence descended, wider and deeper than any canyon. He looked at her not as his daughter, but as a stranger, a reckless force that had just doomed them all. Without another word, he turned his back on her, a dismissal more complete than any shout. He walked to the far side of the room and stood staring at the wall, his posture a wall of its own. The rift was carved between them, filled with the unspoken words of a love stretched to its breaking point, and the chilling understanding that some choices can never be unmade. Its timbered roof lost in shadow, its walls lined with the faded banners of forgotten victories. Torches guttered in iron sconces, casting a restless orange light that danced across the stern faces of the village elders, seated in a semicircle. At the center, upon a throne-like chair carved from a single ancient oak, sat Chieftain Borin, his broad frame draped in furs. His eyes as cold and gray as winter stone. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, stale ale, and the heavy scent of authority. Caius stood before them, no longer the spurned suitor, but the aggrieved nobleman, his rage meticulously forged into a weapon of formal complaint. He had traded his fine tunic for a simpler, darker one, a calculated display of somber dignity. His narrative was not one of personal humiliation, but of civic danger. He painted Alara's refusal not as a personal slight, but as an act of treasonous defiance, a dangerous spark that threatened the very tinderbox of social order. He spoke of her words not as a rejection of him, but as a rejection of the chieftain's authority, of the elders' wisdom, of the traditions that bound their world together. Her desire for autonomy was twisted into a seditious ambition, her spirit recast as a threat to the stability of every household. He was no longer a man seeking a wife. He was a guardian of the peace, bringing a dangerous malcontent to justice. The elders listened, their aged faces masks of grave concern. They saw not a young woman's courage, but the unsettling specter of change. They saw the chieftain's son, their future leader, his pride wounded and his power questioned. In the flickering light, Ilara's act of self-preservation was reshaped into a contagion that needed to be quarantined. A branch that needed to be pruned before the whole tree was infected. Nods of agreement passed among them. A silent consensus built on fear of the chieftain's displeasure and a deep-seated aversion to anything that disrupted the established hierarchy. Chieftain Borin's expression remained an unreadable cliff face, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. His son's humiliation was his own, a public challenge to the family's unassailable right to take what it wanted. The girl's defiance was an insult that could not be allowed to stand, lest it give other foolish ideas to other common-born girls. The law was clear on matters of obedience, and the consequences for those who disrupted the harmony he enforced. His gaze swept over the assembled elders, seeing their compliance, and then settled on some distant point, his decision already made. He raised a hand, and the murmuring in the hall ceased instantly. His voice, when it came, was low and carried the weight of final judgment, echoing off the high beams. He declared the matter grave, a poison in the village as well. The girl Alara, daughter of Lorcan, would be summoned to stand before them. She would answer for her defiance. The word trial was spoken, but in the grim set of his mouth and the cold approval in the eyes of the elders, it was clear the verdict had already been reached in the shadowed spaces between Caius's accusations. The summons was not an invitation to a debate. It was a command to receive a sentence. The summons came not with a gentle knock, but with the heavy rhythmic pounding of a mailed fist against the cottage door, a sound that echoed the dread tightening around Elara's heart. Two of the chieftain's personal guards stood silhouetted against the dawn, their faces impassive masks beneath their helms. They did not speak, merely gestured for her to follow. Her father would not meet her eyes as she was led away, his figure slumped in the doorway, a portrait of defeated shame. Her mother's soft weeping was the only sound that followed her into the cold morning air. The path to the great hall felt longer than ever before, each step a march toward an inescapable fate. Villagers peered from their windows and doorways, their expressions a mixture of morbid curiosity and thinly veiled fear. They saw not a neighbor, but a disruption, a problem being taken away to be solved. The heavy oak doors of the hall groaned open, and Alara was ushered into the same oppressive atmosphere she had left in her imagination the night before. The torches still burned, the elders still sat in stern judgment. And Caius stood to the side, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips now that his prize was within reach. She was made to stand in the center of the semicircle, a single, unarmed figure against the assembled power of the village. The chieftain's gaze was like a physical weight upon her. The charge hung in the air, monstrous and absurd. Treason. But a strange calm settled over Alara then. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a clarity of purpose. This was not a trial for truth, it was a performance of power. She drew a slow breath, her voice when it came, clear and steady, carrying to the farthest shadowed corner of the hall. She spoke not to Caius, nor to his glowering father, but to the elders, appealing to the fragments of wisdom and fairness that might yet remain within them. She spoke of the fundamental right of a person to their own heart and mind. She wove her defense with threads of simple, unassailable logic, painting her refusal not as an act of rebellion against the village, but as an affirmation of its supposed values honor, respect, and the sanctity of a union. She asked them if a life built on the foundation of fear and force could ever be considered strong or righteous. Her words were not fiery, but they were precise, each one a carefully placed stone, building a wall of reason against the tide of their prejudice. For a moment, a flicker of something doubt, perhaps, or ease passed over the faces of a few of the older elders. They saw not a traitor, but a brave, intelligent young woman stating a truth they had long chosen to ignore. The silence in the hall deepened, becoming thoughtful rather than accusatory. It was a fragile moment, a hair's breadth of a chance. And Caius saw it shatter. His father's patience snapped. The chieftain's hand came down on the arm of his chair with a crack that echoed like thunder. He dismissed her words as pretty lies, the clever deceptions of a willful child who understood nothing of power and responsibility. His voice rose, not in debate but in declaration, reinforcing his son's accusations, framing her desire for autonomy as the deepest form of disrespect to their office, their traditions, and their laws. Then Caius stepped forward, his earlier smile gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He did not address the elders. He looked only at Alara, but his words were meant for every man in the room. He spoke of the weakness it would show, the invitations it would extend to other malcontents. He did not threaten her, he'd threatened them. He'd painted a picture of a village unraveling, its authority mocked, its strength diluted, all because they lacked the will to crush a single defiant girl. His was the argument of fear, and it found fertile ground. The wall of reason Alara had built was washed away by the cold, dark tide of Caius's power and his father's unwavering support. The performance was over. The verdict was clear in their eyes long before the sentence would be spoken. The chieftain rose from his throne, his shadow stretching long and monstrous across the packed earth floor, engulfing Alara where she stood. The brief flicker of reason she had kindled in the hall was extinguished, smothered by the weight of tradition and fear. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the finality of a tomb door sealing shut. He spoke of order, of the delicate balance that held their world together, a balance that required the absolute submission of its parts. He spoke of her not as a person, but as a corrupted element, a willful disruption that threatened to unravel the very fabric of their society. Her crime was not merely rejecting a suitor. It was challenging the foundation upon which all power rested. Then he named her punishment. It was the ancient sentence for women who dared to disrupt the social order. A punishment so horrific it was whispered of only in the darkest corners, a tale to frighten children into obedience. It was not meant to be used, not in living memory. It was a relic, a monstrous heirloom of a crueler time. Now dragged into the light by Caius's vindictive pride and his father's cold approval, Alara's breath caught in her throat. The steady courage that had sustained her evaporated, leaving behind a void of pure, uncomprehending shock. Da-da-da-da. This was not banishment, not imprisonment. Death was an erasure. It was a sentence designed to make her not just dead, but forgotten, swallowed by the earth, as if she had never been. Her mind recoiled, unable to grasp the reality of the words. And the world seemed to tilt on its axis, reality dissolving into a nightmare. Before she could form a thought, before a scream could tear itself from her lungs, rough hands seized her. The chieftain's guards, their faces still empty masks, dragged her backward. The torches became a blur of orange light, the stern faces of the elders, a swirling mural of condemnation. The great doors of the hall yawned open, and the cold morning light hit her face, a cruel mockery of the darkness that now awaited her. She was a thing being removed, a problem disposed of. Her future measured not in years, but in the handful of breaths she had left before the earth claimed her. The world narrowed to the brutal grip on her arms and the chilling echo of the chieftain's sentence ringing in her ears, a sound that promised not just death, but utter oblivion. The cell was little more than a hole carved into the cold earth beneath the chieftain's hall, a space so narrow Alara could not lie down, so dark she could not see her own hands before her face. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and old despair, a scent that seemed to have seeped from the very stones over generations of forgotten prisoners. Time had lost all meaning, stretching and contracting in the absolute blackness. Her mind replayed the trial on a ceaseless loop, the cold faces. Caius's smile, the final monstrous pronouncement each, memory of fresh wound in the numbing shroud of her shock. She was no longer a person with a past or a future. She was a sentence waiting to be carried out. A faint scraping sound at the heavy wooden door broke the suffocating silence. A sliver of torchlight pierced the darkness, so painfully bright it made her eyes water. A figure slipped inside, small and hesitant, and the door was pushed shut, plunging them back into near blackness. Save for the weak glow of a single covered lantern the visitor carried. It was her mother. Althea's face, illuminated from below by the lantern's faint light, was a mask of ravaged grief. Tears carved silent paths through the dust on her cheeks, her eyes swollen and red-rimmed. She looked ancient, broken by a pain that went deeper than fear. She did not speak, could not, it seemed, for her breath came in ragged, silent hitches. She simply looked at her daughter, and in that look was an ocean of love and an agony of powerlessness. She moved forward, her steps silent on the earthen floor, and knelt before Alara. Her hands, usually so steady and capable, now trembled violently as they reached out. One cool, calloused palm cupped Alara's cheek, a touch so familiar and yet so freighted with finality that it shattered the last of Alara's numbness. A single hot tear escaped her own eye, tracing a path through the grime on her face. Still wordless, her mother's other hand went to the leather cord around her own neck. With fumbling fingers, she untied it and lifted a small, dark object over her head. It was an amulet, ancient and unassuming, a flat piece of obsidian smoothed by generations of touch, etched with faint, swirling patterns that were almost worn away. It had been in their family for longer than anyone could remember, a quiet heirloom with no known purpose other than to be passed down. Althea pressed the stone into Alara's palm, folding her daughter's fingers over it. Her touch was desperate, A silent plea. It was not a weapon, not a key. It was a piece of home, a fragment of the love that could not save her, a last fragile connection to the world above the earth that would soon claim her. It was all she had left to give. She leaned forward then and wrapped her arms around Alara, pulling her into a fierce, trembling embrace. She held her as she had when Alara was a child, frightened by a storm. But now it was the mother who wept silently into her daughter's shoulder, her body shaking with the force of her sorrow. She held her for a long moment, a lifetime of love compressed into a few stolen seconds in the dark. Then, as suddenly as she had come, she pulled away, her eyes brimming with a sorrow too deep for words, locked with Elare's one last time. It was a look of utter apology, of a love that was boundless but utterly helpless. Without a sound, she rose, picked up her lantern, and slipped back out the door. The lock turned with a soft, definitive click, leaving Alara alone once more in the crushing darkness. The cool weight of the ancient stone pressed against her pounding heart, the ghost of her mother's last embrace still warming her skin. The chosen site was a desolate scrap of land at the village's edge, where the thin soil gave way to stubborn bedrock, and the gnarled, wind-twisted trees seemed to lean away as if in distaste. It was a place of endings, where the earth was too hard for proper graves, reserved for criminals and the unmourned. Here, under a sky the color of dull iron, the guards worked with a grim, methodical efficiency that spoke of a duty they did not relish, but would not shirk. Their shovels bit into the stony ground with a dry, scraping sound, each thrust meeting resistance. They were not digging a deep grave, for the sentence was not about providing a dignified rest. It was a pit, shallow and unyielding, its dimensions just large enough to contain a body, sides rough and uneven where tools had chipped away at the limestone. One of the men paused to wipe sweat from his brow, his gaze flickering toward the gathering crowd before returning to his task with a renewed, almost angry vigor. They worked in near silence, the only sounds the scrape of metal on stone, and their own labored breathing, a stark contrast to the low, buzzing murmur beginning to swell from the path leading to the site. The villagers came not in a solemn procession, but in a slow, hesitant trickle, drawn by a morbid gravity they could not resist. They formed a loose, uneven circle around the work site, their faces a mosaic of conflicted emotion. Some watched with a kind of grim approval, their jaws set, nodding faintly, as if witnessing a necessary, if unpleasant, bit of business. They were the ones who saw the world in strict binaries of order and chaos, and Alara's defiance had tipped the scales dangerously. This punishment was the counterweight, restoring balance. Others could not meet the gaze of the guards, or look directly into the shallow pit. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a horror they dared not voice. They watched from the corners of their vision, their arms crossed tightly over their chests, as if to hold themselves together. They saw not justice, but a profound wrongness, a fear of the chieftain's absolute power eclipsing any sense of righteousness. They were the silent dissenters, their disapproval a cold stone in their stomachs. And then there were those, particularly the younger women, whose expressions held a terrifying fascination. They watched the preparation of the rocky tomb with a dreadful curiosity, their minds perhaps unwillingly placing themselves in that shallow scrape in the earth. It was a brutal lesson, delivered not with words but with actions, a warning etched not on parchment but on the very ground they stood on. The air grew thick with the unspoken thoughts of the crowd, a cocktail of fear, voyeuristic thrill, grim satisfaction, and appalled disbelief all mixing under the heavy gray sky as the guards finished their work and stepped back from the pit. Their task complete. The stage was set. All that was missing was its player. The guards' hands were not gentle as they guided her forward, their grip firm and impersonal on her arms. The rough-spun tunic they had given her felt like a shroud, and the cold morning air bit into her skin with a final bitter kiss. The walk to the pit was a blur of grim faces and averted eyes, a gauntlet of silent judgment. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic trapped thing, but her face remained a mask of stunned disbelief. This could not be real. This was a nightmare from which she would surely wake. They halted at the edge of the excavation. The pit yawned before her, a raw, ugly wound in the earth, shallow and filled with shadows. It smelled of freshly turned stone and damp, ancient clay. A simple rope was produced, looped under her arms with a rough, efficient tug. There would be no dignified descent, no final words. This was an execution of efficiency. As they began to lower her, her eyes instinctively sought the sky, a last desperate grasp at the world of light and air. And it was then that she saw them, the faces that would be her last living memory. Her father stood at the forefront of the crowd, his own gaze fixed somewhere beyond her on the distant tree line. His expression was carved from stone, a rigid monument to duty and fear, but a single tear traced a clean path through the dust on his cheek, betraying the ruin within. He did not look at her. He could not. Near him she saw faces she had known her whole life, the baker whose bread she had bought every morning, the woman who had taught her to weave, the boy she had played with as a child. Their eyes were wide, their mouths slightly agape, but there was no outrage there, no cry of protest. There was only a hollow, compliant fear. They were spectators at a spectacle, their own safety purchased with her silence, their own complicity written in the tense lines of their bodies. They watched her descent, not with malice, but with a terrifying passivity, as if they were observing the weather, a tragic but unstoppable force of nature. Her mother was not there. The absence was a deeper wound than the sight of any of them. The rope creaked, lowering her another foot into the gathering darkness. The walls of the pit rose around her, cutting off the world, narrowing her universe to a circle of pale, fearful faces looking down. She saw the relief in some eyes that it was her and not them. She saw the dawning horror in others, quickly suppressed. She saw Caius, standing slightly apart, his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold, satisfied finality. He was not just burying a woman. He was burying an idea, and his triumph was absolute. Then the bottom of the pit met her feet. The rope went slack and was pulled away, coiling back up into the light like a serpent retreating. She was alone. The circle of faces above seemed to recede, fading into a distant constellation of pale ovals against the gray sky. They were the last testament to the life she had known, a life built on connections that had proven as fragile as spider silk in a storm. In their eyes, she saw no hope of reprieve, no last-minute redemption. She saw only the end, reflected back at her 100 times over. The darkness at the edges of the pit began to seep inward, not just an absence of light, but a tangible presence, cold and patient, waiting to claim its prize. A heavy silence fell, thick and unnatural, broken only by the dry rustle of the wind through the twisted trees at the edge of the burial ground. The circle of faces above Alara seemed to hold a collective breath, a moment of suspended horror before the inevitable descent into brutality. She stood frozen in the shallow pit, her gaze locked on the cold gray expanse of sky, a last fragile tether to the world of the living. Her fingers, numb with cold and dread, found the smooth, familiar shape of the obsidian amulet tucked inside her tunic. She clutched it as if it were the only solid thing in a universe that had dissolved into nightmare. The ceremony required no priest, no chant, no plea to the gods for mercy or understanding. Its only ritual was efficiency. One of the guards, a man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that refused to meet hers, stepped forward. He held a shovel, its blade dark with the damp, stony earth they had just excavated. He did not look at her. He looked at the pile of dirt beside the pit, a dark mound against the pale rock. With a grunt of effort, he drove the shovel into the pile. The sound was a dull, wet thud. He lifted it, the metal blade heaped with dark soil and small, sharp fragments of limestone. For a heartbeat, the shovelful hung suspended against the sky, a grotesque parody of an offering. Then he turned his wrists. The world dissolved into a choking, gritty rain. The first shovelful of earth struck her shoulder and the side of her head with a force that was more shocking than painful. It was not soft loam, but cold, heavy clay studded with sharp stones that scraped her skin. The impact drove the air from her lungs in a short, panicked gasp. The smell of it filled her nostrils, an ancient, damp, and profoundly final. Grit filled her mouth, grinding between her teeth with the taste of the grave. A raw animal sound tore from her throat, half gasp, half sob. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a frantic bird trying to escape a cage. She squeezed the amulet so tightly its edges bit into her palm, a tiny, sharp pain that was the only thing feeling real amidst the surreal horror. She looked up, blinking against the dust, and saw the guard already loading his shovel again. His movements were mechanical, devoid of emotion. Behind him, another guard stepped up with his own tool, ready to take his turn. The rhythm of it was the most terrifying thing of all, the methodical, unstoppable nature of her own burial. Another shovelful rained down, this one striking her legs, the weight of it making her stagger backward against the unyielding wall of the pit. Then another and another. The earth began to pile around her ankles, cold and clinging. Each impact was a hammer blow against her sanity. Each gasp of gritty air, a smaller, more desperate sip of life. The circle of faces above began to blur, obscured by the falling dirt and the tears she could no longer hold back. Their silence was a roar in her ears, a condemnation more absolute than any shouted curse. This was it. Not with a blade or a drop, but with the slow, crushing, mundane weight of the earth itself, shoveled onto her by men who would go home to their dinners after their task complete. Her breath came in short, ragged, panicked gasps, each one a fight against the settling dust and the crushing weight of despair. The rhythm of the shovels was a death knell, each fall of earth a measured beat in the dirge of her burial. The soil was past her knees now, a cold, heavy anchor pulling her down into the embrace of the earth. Her body was a map of aches, the scrape of stone against skin, the deep chill seeping into her bones. The burning strain in her thighs from fighting the settling weight. Her gasps were shallow, frantic things, each inhalation tasting of grit and the iron tang of her own fear. The world had narrowed to the shrinking circle of sky above, a disk of leaden gray that grew smaller with every passing moment. Then the sound changed. The soft, relentless thud of earth was replaced by the heavier, definitive scrape of stone on stone. The guards were no longer shoveling soil. They were lifting the final, flat capstones that would seal the pit, slabs of limestone that had been waiting at the edge of the excavation like patient sentinels. The first one grated into place over a portion of the opening, blocking out a swath of the sky. The dim light faded further. A second stone followed, then a third, their edges grinding together as they were fitted into a cruel, jagged puzzle. Alara's panic reached a fever pitch. A raw, soundless scream locked in her throat. She threw her hands up, as if her bare, bleeding fingers could possibly halt the inexorable progress of the stones. But they were beyond her reach, a world away. The last slab, the largest of them, was maneuvered into the final gap. For a terrifying moment, she saw a sliver of sky, a fragment of a guard's grimacing face, the deep gray of the clouds. Then, with a final grunting heave from above, the stones slid home. The sound it made was not loud, but it was absolute. A soft, final scrape, and then nothing. Absolute blackness. A blackness so complete it was a physical substance, pressing against her eyes, filling her mouth, flowing into her lungs. It was a void beyond any night she had ever known, a suffocating blanket that smothered sight, sound, and hope in one fell swoop. The silence that followed was even more profound. The murmurs of the crowd, the scuff of boots on stone, the sigh of the wind doll were extinguished. The only sound was the wild, frantic drumming of her own heart in her ears, a terrified echo in a tiny, sealed space. She was entombed, walled in by stone and earth. The air, what little was left of it, grew instantly stale, thick with the smell of damp clay and her own terror. Her belief that fragile, stubborn flame of hope that had flickered even through the trial and the descent was finally and utterly snuffed out. This was no nightmare from which she would awaken, screaming into her mother's arms. This was the end. The certainty of it settled over her more heavily than the earth ever could. There was no escape, no reprieve, no last-minute miracle. Her story was over, its final chapter written in stone and sealed beneath the indifferent earth. A profound and absolute despair, colder than the soil around her, claimed her. Her mind, unable to bear the reality, began to retreat, pulling away from the horror of the crushing dark, the stale, thinning air, and the finality of the stone above her. Consciousness frayed at the edges, unraveling into a welcome, silent nothingness. She truly believed this was the end. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent, choking resurgence. A searing pain lanced through her skull and her lungs convulsed, dragging in a desperate, ragged breath that was more dust than air. She coughed, a raw, hacking spasm that shook her entire frame, each expulsion stirring the fine, suffocating grit that coated her lips and tongue. For a disorienting moment, The absolute blackness and the crushing pressure on her legs convinced her she was dead, that this choking agony was some bleak anteroom of the afterlife. But the pain was too vivid, too specific. The cold ache in her bones, the throbbing in her scraped and bloody hands, the relentless, pounding fear, these were the currencies of the living. She was still in the tomb. Panic, her old companion, surged back with the force of a tidal wave, threatening to drown what little reason remained. Her breath hitched, coming in short, useless gasps that only made the dust dance and settle deeper in her throat. The weight of the earth was immense, pinning her from the waist down, a cold, patient claim on her body. She tried to scream, but the sound was a pathetic, dusty croak. Swallowed whole by the overwhelming silence and the narrow confines of her prison. The futility of it was a second burial, more psychological than physical. Her mind began to spiral, images of the shovels, the stones, the cold faces flashing behind her eyes, promising a madness more final than any suffocation. Then a miracle, faint, almost imperceptible brush of movement against her cheek. Not earth, air. It was the barest whisper, a cool tendril snaking through the stagnant gloom. She froze, every atom of her being focused on that sensation. She turned her head minutely, her neck protesting with a sharp crick, and there it was again, slightly stronger, a draft. It was coming from a narrow fissure in the rock wall beside her. A crack she had not known was there, hidden by the darkness and the angle of her entombment. Hope, a treacherous and fragile thing, flickered in the void of her despair. It was not much. The air pocket was small, the fissure likely nothing more than a fracture in the capstone, but it was a thread, a possibility where moments before there had been none. The panic did not vanish, but it receded, its chaotic energy channeled into a single, desperate imperative. Live, her will to survive, thought extinguished, roared back to life with a ferocity that shocked her. The acceptance of death was burned away in the cold fire of that single gasp of air. She was not done. They had buried her, but they had not killed her, not yet. Her fingers, stiff and aching, uncurled from the amulet still clutched in her palm, and instead began to explore the fissure, tracing its narrow length, feeling for weakness, for purchase, for any chance at all. The darkness was no longer just an end. It was a challenge. For the first time since the first shovelful of earth had fallen, Ilara began to fight. In the absolute blackness, time was a meaningless concept, measured only by the ragged rhythm of her breathing and the slow aching exploration of her fingers along the narrow fissure in the rock. The cold seeped deeper into her bones, a patient, insidious thief, stealing what little warmth her frantic movements generated. Her world had shrunk to the feel of rough stone, the weight of compacted earth, and the faint, teasing whisper of air from the crack a lifeline, so slender it felt like a taunt. Despair and determination warred within her, a silent, brutal battle fought in the confines of her own mind in the unyielding dark, as in the deepest trough of this struggle. As her bleeding fingertips found no purchase and her hopes began to fray once more, that the change began. A faint sensation of warmth bloomed against her chest, a subtle heat that cut through the pervasive chill. At first she thought it a trick of her desperate mind, a phantom warmth conjured by her body's failing systems. But it grew, intensifying from a vague sensation to a distinct, localized heat centered over her heart. Confused, her numb fingers fumbled inside her tunic, closing around the smooth, familiar shape of the obsidian amulet her mother had given her. It was the source of the warmth, the stone itself seeming to radiate a gentle, living heat that was utterly alien to the cold rock surrounding her. She drew it out, the leather cord pulling tight around her neck, and then it began to glow. It was not a bright, blinding light, but a soft, eerie luminescence that pulsed from within the depths of the dark stone. The ancient, nearly worn-away etchings on its surface seemed to fill with a faint, milky light, making them visible for the first time. The light was a pale, spectral green, the color of moss on a sun-starved stone or of deep, still water reflecting a forgotten moon. It cast no beams, but instead emanated a weak, phosphorescent halo that pushed back the absolute blackness, transforming it into a world of deep, murky shadows. Ilara stared, her breath catching in her throat, all thought of the fissure and the digging forgotten. The glow was unnatural, impossible, a fragment of magic in a world that had shown her only cruelty and cold stone. In its faint, unearthly light, her tomb was revealed to her for the first time. The space was even more cramped and horrific than she had imagined. The walls were not smooth, but jagged and uneven, studded with sharp protrusions of limestone that had scraped her skin raw. The earth packed around her legs was dark and dense, holding her in a cold, gritty embrace. Above her, the capstones formed a low, oppressive ceiling, their rough-hewn surfaces looking like the underbelly of some great beast. She could see the narrow crack from which the air whispered, a dark line in the stone that seemed to drink the amulet's light rather than reflect it. The air itself was visible in the glow, thick with swirling motes of dust that her panicked breathing had stirred up. The amulet's light did not offer hope of escape, but it offered something perhaps more vital in that moment: knowledge. It banished the formless terror of the absolute dark and replaced it with a defined, however terrible, reality. She could see her prison. She could see the confines of her world. And in that seeing, a cold, clear purpose began to crystallize. The warmth from the stone seeped into her palm, comfort that was both strange and deeply familiar, as if the spirits of all the women who had ever held it were now lending her their strength. The glow was a silent answer to the darkness, a declaration that she was not yet alone, and that her story was not yet over. The amulet's unearthly glow painted her prison in shades of ghostly green, revealing not just the confines of her tomb, but the stark, brutal tools of her potential escape. The fissure in the wall was a dark, mocking seam, but near its base, a shard of limestone had been jarred loose by the settling of the capstones. It was longer than her hand, one end tapered to a cruel, jagged point. In the eerie light, it looked less like a rock and more like a tooth pried from the jaw of the earth itself. Her fingers, already raw and caked with dried blood and dirt, closed around it. The stone was cold and unyielding, its rough edges biting into her palm, a fresh pain atop the symphony of aches that was her body. But the pain was an anchor, a sensation that tethered her to the will to live that now burned within her, fanned by the amulet's impossible warmth. She shifted her weight as much as the packed earth around her legs would allow, angling herself toward the wall where the air whispered its tantalizing promise. The first strike was a clumsy, desperate thing. She drove the pointed end of the shard against the packed earth beside the fissure. The impact jarred her arm to the shoulder, sending a fresh wave of pain through her already tortured muscles. A few crumbs of dry soil pattered down. It was nothing, a pathetic effort. A sob of frustration welled in her throat, but she choked it back, swallowing the taste of dust and despair. She adjusted her grip, her breath fogging in the chill, green-tinged air. Again and again. The rhythm was agonizingly slow, each strike a monumental effort in the cramped space. She was not digging so much as she was pecking, chipping away at the unyielding wall fragment by tiny fragment. Her world shrank to the few square inches of earth in the halo of the amulet's light, to the scrape of stone on soil, to the burning fire in her lungs with each labored breath. Her fingers, slippery with fresh blood, lost their grip on the shard. It clattered against the rock wall, the sound absurdly loud in the tomb-like silence. She fumbled for it, her movements becoming frantic, her carefully husbanded resolve threatening to unravel. Finding it, she clutched it tighter, her blood making the stone tacky in her hand. She did not pause. She could not afford to. Every second was a measured portion of her dwindling air. Every moment of hesitation, a surrender. She switched tactics, using the sharper point to worry at the edges of the fissure itself. Trying to widen the narrow crack, to coax a greater breath of the outside world into her suffocating hole. Tiny slivers of rock splintered away. The work was even slower, more precise, requiring a control her trembling, exhausted body could barely muster. Her shoulders screamed in protest, her back ached from the unnatural angle, and a deep, rattling cough periodically racked her frame, each spasm stealing precious air and scattering her hard-won piles of debris. Time lost all meaning. There was only the strike, the scrape, the gasp for air. The amulet's glow watched over her, a silent, spectral witness to her brutal labor. It illuminated the grim progress, the small, pathetic pile of loosened earth and stone chips gathering between her legs, the fresh, glistening blood that now coated the digging stone and her hands, making her grip tenuous. Her breaths became the center of her universe, each one a shallow, burning sip of life, each exhalation a prayer for strength. She was no longer a woman, but a machine of pain and determination. Clawing at the earth with the last vestiges of her strength, her entire being focused on the single impossible goal of reaching the world that had buried her alive. The rhythmic, mind-numbing scrape of stone on earth was the only sound in Elara's world, a metronome marking the agonizingly slow passage of time. Her arms moved with a mechanical determination that belied the fire in her muscles and the raw, bloody state of her fingers. Each strike was a small rebellion, each tiny fragment of dislodged soil, a victory measured in grains. The amulet's eerie green glow illuminated her focus, a small circle of hellish light in the overwhelming dark. Her universe was this: the cold rock wall, the jagged tool in her grip, the burning in her lungs, and the faint, mocking whisper of air from the fissure. Then a new sound penetrated her singular focus, faint, distant drumming, soft and persistent. It was a sound so alien to the crushing silence of the tomb that at first her addled mind dismissed it as a trick of the blood roaring in her ears. But it grew steadily louder, more distinct or rapid, percussive patter that seemed to vibrate through the very stone around her. Rain, a sudden heavy downpour, was lashing the earth above her. The sound was a torrent, a roar of water hitting stone and soil, a symphony of the living world from which she was exiled. For a heart-lifting moment, a wild, impossible hope flared within her. Water would soften the earth. The dense, packed clay that had resisted her every effort would become malleable, yielding. Her frantic digging would become 100 times easier. The path to the surface, once a brutal fantasy, suddenly seemed tantalizingly possible. A sob of relief mixed with desperation caught in her throat. But the hope was short-lived, crushed by a new and more immediate terror. The sound of the rain was not just above her. It was all around her. New sensation began, a slow, cold seepage. At first, it was just a dampness against her legs, where she was pinned, a chilling kiss through the rough fabric of her tunic. Then it became a trickle, a thin stream of muddy water finding its way through the same narrow fissure that had given her air. It snaked down the rock wall, dark and slick in the amulet's glow, pooling around her thighs. The water rose with alarming speed, fed by the torrential rain. The loose pile of soil and stone chips she had painstakingly gathered began to dissolve into a thick, cloying sludge. The earth around her legs, once merely heavy, now became a cold, sucking quagmire, gripping her with a new, terrifying tenacity. The air in the pocket grew thick with humidity and the smell of wet clay, each breath heavier and more difficult to draw. The drumming of the rain was no longer a promise of aid. It was the sound of her tomb filling the fissure. Her lifeline for air was now a conduit for drowning. Alara's frantic digging became a race against two enemies, the unyielding earth and the rising water. Each strike of her stone tool was more desperate, more wild. The water was at her waist now, shockingly cold, sapping what little warmth and strength she had left. The amulet's glow reflected off the dark, swirling surface, creating dizzying patterns that seemed to mock her efforts. She was caught between the rock and the flood, her tiny pocket of air shrinking not from soil but from water, each gasp potentially her last. The sound of the rain, once a symbol of life, had become the herald of a new, more intimate death. The cold water was a vice around her waist, its relentless rise a silent, chilling countdown. Each frantic, clawing motion was a battle against the thickening sludge. The once dry earth now a cold, sucking mire that fought to hold her, to claim her. Her strength was a guttering candle, her arms leaden, her breath a ragged, burning saw in her chest. The amulet's eerie green light danced on the swirling dark water, illuminating the hopelessness of her task. The fissure she had worked so long to widen now wept a continuous muddy stream, a cruel betrayal by the very element she had prayed would be her salvation. Her mind began to fray, the edges of consciousness blurring into a haze of exhaustion, pain, and cold. Visions flickered at the periphery of her awareness, her mother's tear-streaked face, Caius's cold smile, the circle of pale, watching ovals against the gray sky. They were ghosts in the flooding dark, beckoning her toward surrender, to stop, to let the cold numbness take her. It would be so easy. The water was at her chest now, its icy touch stealing the breath from her lungs. One last strike. Final pathetic scrape of stone on sodden earth. Her fingers, stripped raw and numb, lost their grip on the shard. It slipped from her blood-slick grasp and vanished into the murky water with a soft plop. She had fought, and she had lost. Her head fell back against the unyielding rock, her eyes closing against the ghostly green glow. She waited for the water to claim her, for the darkness to become permanent. But as her body slumped in defeat, her outstretched hand, dangling uselessly above the water, brushed against something different. Not the rough, wet stone of the wall, something colder, finer, loose soil, not packed and heavy, but soft and yielding. The torrential rain had done its work, washing away the earth above the capstones, undermining their edges, creating a weakness where before there had been none. A final spark of instinct, a primal refusal to die, flared through the overwhelming fatigue. They sank in easily, meeting little resistance. She pulled a weak, convulsive movement. She did it again and again. Each handful was an agony, each motion fueled by a reserve of strength she did not know she possessed. She was no longer digging with purpose or plan. She was an animal, clawing blindly upward, driven by a base, screaming need for air into open space. A shock of cold, clean air, laden with the smell of rain and wet earth, washed over her scraped knuckles. The sensation was so sudden, so alien, after an eternity of stifling damp and dust, that it froze her for a heartbeat. She pushed her arm upward, her shoulders screaming in protest, her hands scrambling through the loosened earth. She felt the drumming of the downpour directly on her skin, a sensation so vividly, painfully alive, it was like a lightning strike to her soul. With a final, gut-trenching heave that tore a cry from her throat, she pulled. Her head and shoulders erupted from the earth into the raging tempest of the night. She dragged in a breath, a great convulsive gasp of cold, wet air that burned her lungs with its purity. She collapsed forward onto the churned, muddy ground, her body convulsing, vomiting muddy water. Her fingers digging into the solid, glorious earth as the storm roared its welcome overhead. She was free, but lying broken in the mud. She was barely a woman anymore, just a collection of pain. An instinct hollowed out and reborn into a world that had tried its best to erase her. The world was a symphony of sensation, each one a brutal and beautiful shock after the silent, suffocating dark. Icy rain needled her skin, washing the filth from her face in stinging rivulets. Mud, cold and thick, pressed against her cheek, its earthy scent a profound relief after the cloying damp of the tomb. She lay half in, half out of the earth, her body convulsing with the effort of drawing breath, each gasp a raw, burning triumph. Her muscles pushed far beyond any reasonable limit, trembled uncontrollably, refusing to obey any command but the base instinct to breathe, to exist. Disorientation held her in a dizzying thrall. The world tilted and spun, a chaotic swirl of darkness, lashing rain, and the distant, blurred smudges of light that had to be the village. Her mind, so long focused on the singular goal of survival, struggled to process the reality of success. She was out. The stone lid was broken. The earth had released her. She was free. The thought was too vast, too monumental to fully grasp. It echoed in the hollowed-out chambers of her consciousness, a fact without feeling. Weakness was a leaden weight in every limb. The frantic, superhuman strength that had propelled her through the final moments of her escape had vanished, leaving behind a body that was little more than a vessel of pain and exhaustion she could not stand. She could barely lift her head. She could only lie there in the churned muck, a creature born anew from soil and storm, too broken to move, too alive to succumb. The very storm that had nearly drowned her had now become her savior, its ferocity a perfect cloak for her resurrection. The wind howled, whipping the sheets of rain into a nearly impenetrable curtain. The thunder, a continuous, low growl overhead, masked any sound she might have made. No guard would be walking the perimeter of the burial grounds on a night like this. They would be huddled in dry shelters, believing their grim duty complete and their charge forever silenced. Her escape, her first ragged breaths of freedom, went utterly unnoticed, hidden by nature's violent fury. Her vision, blurred by rain and exhaustion, slowly focused on those distant lights, the village, home. A weak, desperate yearning surged within her, longing for warmth, for dry clothes, for her mother's arms. the familiar safety of her own bed. It was a child's impulse, born of utter vulnerability. For a fleeting moment, it was all she wanted. But as the cold rain washed the last of the tomb's dust from her eyes, the reality of those lights sharpened into terrible focus. They were not beacons of safety. They were the windows of the chieftain's hall, the homes of the elders, the cottage of the friend who might have helped her. They were the lights of the people who had watched her be lowered into the earth, who had allowed it, who would, by law and by fear, be compelled to drag her back to that rocky pit if she were ever foolish enough to return. Her father's turned back, the crowd's passive faces, Caius's triumphant smirk, these memories were a colder drenching than any rain. The village was no longer her home. It was the heart of the territory that had condemned her. Those lights, once a symbol of community and warmth, now seemed like the cold, watchful eyes of a predator. She had broken the surface of the earth, but she would never break back into the life she had known. That life was buried just as surely as she had been. As she lay trembling in the mud, the storm weeping around her, the dreadful understanding settled in her bones. Her escape was only the beginning of a new, more uncertain sentence. She was free, but she was utterly alone, and more lost than she had ever been in the darkness beneath the stones. The storm's fury began to wane, the relentless drumming of rain softening to a steady, mournful patter. The wind sighed, its earlier howl reduced to a whisper through the gnarled trees at the edge of the burial ground. Lying in the churned muddy earth, Alara felt the cold seep deeper into her bones, a penetrating chill that was far more effective than the fading rain at rousing her from the stupor of exhaustion and shock. Every inch of her was a tapestry of pain, her lungs burned with each ragged breath, her muscles screamed in protest at the slightest movement, and her hands were ruined landscapes of torn flesh and caked blood. But it was the cold that forced clarity upon her, a brutal and unwelcome gift. Slowly, agonizingly, she pushed herself up onto her elbows. The world swam nauseatingly for a moment before settling into a grim, watercolor reality of deep shadows and dripping silence. Her gaze was drawn, as if by a lodestone, back to the distant, hazy lights of the village. They glowed like fallen stars in the valley below, each one representing a hearth, a family, a life continuing on, utterly unaware that the woman they had buried now breathed the same air they did. The yearning for home was a physical ache, a hollow pull in her chest. She imagined pushing open her own door, stumbling into the warmth, her mother's cry of shock turning to tears of joy. The fantasy was vivid, sweet, and utterly poisonous. It dissolved as quickly as it formed, replaced by the cold. Hard truth she had glimpsed in her father's averted eyes, and the crowd as silent compliance. Her return would not be a miracle. It would be a death sentence for them all. Her family would be the first ones the guards would question. Her father, to prove his loyalty and save what was left of his family, would have no choice. He would turn her in himself. Her mother would be forced to watch again, as her daughter was dragged away, this time with no pretense of a trial, no chance of a reprieve. Her escape would only magnify their disgrace and ensure their ruin. The village lights, once symbols of comfort, now looked like the watchfires of an enemy camp. Every shadow between them seemed to hold a guard, every flicker of movement a potential betrayer. There was no sanctuary there, no forgiveness. The social order she had disrupted would demand her blood a second time, and the price of that demand would be extracted from everyone she had ever loved. Her only option lay in the opposite direction. She turned her head, her neck stiff and protesting, to look upon the vast, impenetrable darkness of the mountains that reared behind the burial grounds. They were a jagged black tear in the lesser darkness of the sky, their peaks lost in the low, scudding clouds. They were a place of legend and fear, a wilderness where the village's laws held no sway, and its hunters rarely ventured. It was a land of sharp rocks, deep snows even in spring, and predators both animal and rumored to be otherwise. To flee into them was to exchange a quick, public death for a slow, private one, to starvation, to exposure, to whatever ancient horrors called those heights home. It was no choice at all. It was the selection of one certain end over another, but one end offered a semblance of agency. One end allowed her to die on her own terms, fighting for each additional breath of free air, rather than on her knees before Caius and his father. The mountains were unforgiving, but they were not cruel. With a groan that was torn from the depths of her soul, Ilara forced her battered body to obey. The village at her back was a ghost, a memory, a life severed. Taking a final, shuddering breath of the rain-cleansed air, she turned her back on the lights of everything she had ever known and took her first stumbling step into the unknown dark. She was a fugitive, and her only choice was to walk toward the hunger of the wild, leaving the certainty of the grave behind. The mountains were a wall of teeth against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky, their peaks sharp and unforgiving. Ilara's progress was a slow, agonizing crawl, each step a negotiation with pain and exhaustion. The storm had washed her clean of the grave's mud, but it had left a deep, shivering cold in its wake that no amount of movement could dispel. Her ruined hands were clumsy clubs, her body a collection of screaming protests. She needed shelter. She needed warmth. And a desperate, foolish hope flickered in her chest, the hope of a friendly face. Lysias's croft was the farthest from the village, nestled in a high meadow where the mountain's breath was always cold. He had been a friend once, a boy with straw-colored hair and an easy laugh, who had shared stolen apples with her and dreamed childish dreams of seeing the world beyond the valley. That boy was a lifetime ago. But the memory was a warmth she clung to as she stumbled toward the faint plume of smoke rising from his chimney. She approached not like a visitor, but like a wounded animal, keeping to the tree line until the last possible moment. Her knock on the heavy door was a feeble scraping sound, more like the scratch of a branch in the wind than a human request. The door creaked open a few inches, and Lysias's face appeared, blurred by shadow and sleep. Then they widened, the sleep vanishing, replaced by a shock so profound it seemed to freeze him in place. He saw a ghost, a thing of mud and blood and tattered rags, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity, in a face pale as bone. He saw Ilara, whom the whole village knew was sealed in the earth. Instead, a strange, calculating stillness came over him. He ushered her inside quickly, his movements brisk, his gaze darting past her into the darkness to ensure they were not seen. The warmth of the single room was a physical blow, so overwhelming after the hours of cold that she nearly swooned. He sat her by the fire, wrapping a rough blanket around her shaking shoulders, and pressed a cup of lukewarm broth into her numb hands. He asked no questions. The heat of the fire seeped into her bones. The broth was a balm to her raw throat. The tension began to leach from her body, replaced by a dangerous, trusting lethargy. She had been right to come. Then Lysias moved to the window, pretending to adjust the shutter. His posture was too stiff, his attention too focused on the path leading back to the village. The moment stretched, thin and brittle. The silence in the room was no longer comfortable. It was charged with a waiting tension. Ilara's instincts, honed by betrayal and burial, screamed a belated warning. Kindness had been too efficient, too devoid of the questions any normal person would have asked. Her hand tightened on the clay cup. She saw it then, the faint, quickly concealed flicker in his eyes as he glanced from the window to a small, sharp hunting knife lying on the table. It was not a look of concern for her. It was the look of a man weighing a reward against a risk. The truth crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. He was not sheltering her. He was detaining her. The warmth of the fire became a trap, the broth a poison of false comfort. He was waiting for enough light to make the journey to the village, to report the ghost he had captured for the coin she was surely worth. A coldness far deeper than the mountain's chills settled in her heart. She moved without thought, a surge of adrenaline overriding her exhaustion. As he turned from the window, a placating false smile beginning to form on his lips, she threw the contents of the cup into his face. He stumbled back, blinded and sputtering. It was not much, but it was enough. She was out the door and into the freezing dawn before he could regain his sight. She did not look back, plunging into the tree line, her body protesting every step with fresh agony. Behind her, she heard his shout. Not of concern, but of angry frustration, followed by the sound of him giving clumsy chase for a few paces before thinking better of it and turning back, no doubt, to sound the alarm. She ran until the stitch in her side was a white-hot knife and her lungs felt shredded. Finally, she collapsed behind a fallen log, her body heaving, listening. No sounds of pursuit yet, but they would come. The lesson was carved into her soul now, as deep and cold as the mountain rock. Trust was a luxury for the safe. For those who slept under roofs, and believed in the goodness of their neighbors. For her, it was a poison. The world had not just buried her body, it had buried every naive notion she had ever held. She was alone, and the only person she could rely on was the cold, hardened creature she was being forced to become. The mountains offered no pity, no shelter, only a vast, indifferent arena for her suffering. The fleeting warmth and cruel betrayal at Lycius's croft were seared into her memory, a final brand severing her from the world of men. Now, there was only the wild, and it was as merciless as the people she had fled. Hunger was a constant gnawing companion, a hollow ache in her belly that grew more insistent with every passing hour. Her knowledge of the forest's bounty was that of a village gardener, useless in this harsh, high altitude. She recognized none of the tough, scrubby plants that clung to the rocks. Once, she tried chewing on a leathery leaf, only to retch up bitter bile that burned her already raw throat. Her stomach cramped, a vicious knot of emptiness that made her dizzy. She scooped handfuls of snow into her mouth, the meltwater so cold it made her teeth ache, but it did nothing to quiet the relentless demand for food. The world began to take on a faint, shimmering quality, her thoughts becoming slow and muddled. She saw visions of roasted meats and crusty bread, the phantom smells so vivid they were a torture. The body was consuming itself, and the mountain air offered no sustenance. The cold was a more immediate and predatory enemy. As the sun began its feeble descent, the temperature plummeted. The wind, which had been a constant sigh, sharpened into a blade that sliced through her thin, damp tunic as if it were nothing. It sought out every scrape, every cut, every inch of exposed skin, laying its icy claim. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, a frantic, useless rhythm that did nothing to generate warmth. Her fingers, already torn and bloody, grew stiff and clumsy, turning a mottled, frightening white. Each breath was a cloud of agony, the frozen air scraping her lungs. Shelter was a desperate, elusive dream. The rocky outcrops offered shallow overhangs that did little more than break the wind's direct assault, still leaving her exposed to the elements. She huddled in one such crevice, drawing her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. The stone at her back leached what little warmth remained in her body. The shivering became so violent it was a full-body convulsion shaking her to the core. Darkness fell, absolute and starless, and with it came a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her, squeezing the life from her lungs. The elements held no malice, no conscious cruelty. Their indifference was what made them so utterly terrifying. The wind did not hate her. It simply flowed where the pressure dictated. The cold did not seek her out. It was the natural state of the night at this altitude. The mountain did not care if she lived or died upon its slopes. This was not a punishment inflicted by man. It was the simple, brutal reality of an unwelcoming world. She was an insignificant speck in a vast, uncaring mechanism, and her suffering was as meaningless as the erosion of a stone. As the night deepened and the cold began to numb the pain into a dangerous lethargy, Alara understood that the wilderness was not a refuge. It was merely a different kind of tomb, one without walls, where the sky itself was the capstone and the wind was the shovelful of earth. The wind that scoured the high passes was a living thing, a voice of the mountain itself. It had howled with the storm's fury and now sighed with a desolate loneliness that seeped into Alara's very bones. She huddled in the lee of a granite spire, a mere speck of warmth against the stone's ancient cold. Hunger was a dull, constant throb, and exhaustion a leaden weight pressing her into the earth. Her mind, starved and frozen, had begun to fray at the edges, conjuring phantoms in the shifting mist and strange shapes in the moon-bleached rocks. At first, the new sound was just another layer of the wind's endless monologue, a faint, high keening that rose and fell with the gusts. She dismissed it as the cry of some distant hunting bird or the protest of wind through a narrow fissure. But as the night wore on and her consciousness wavered on the precipice of sleep, the sound began to change. It coalesced, forming patterns that were almost but not quite intelligible. It was not one voice, but many, a chorus of sighs woven into the fabric of the gale. They were whispers, faint, disembodied, and achingly sorrowful. They had no source, seeming to emanate from the air itself, from the stone at her back, from the very ground beneath her. They were the echoes of a profound and ancient grief, a sadness so deep it felt bottomless. The words, if they were words, were in no language she knew, yet their meaning was unmistakable loss, betrayal, a longing for a justice that had never come. A fresh, violent shiver racked her frame, and her hand instinctively closed around the obsidian amulet still hanging from her neck. As her chilled fingers made contact, the whispers sharpened. The mournful chorus seemed to focus, the ethereal voices drawing closer, their intangible attention fixing upon her. The amulet, usually cool to the touch, pulsed with a faint answering warmth, as if it recognized the presence of the whispers and was responding in kind. The voices were not speaking to the mountain or the wind. They were speaking to her. They were drawn to the amulet, yes, but more than that, they were drawn to the profound suffering that radiated from her, like heat from a fever. Her pain was a beacon in the desolate dark, a signal they recognized. Their whispers were no longer just a sound. They became a sensation, a cold caress against her skin, a pressure in her mind. They spoke of graves unmarked and stories untold, of tears shed into uncaring soil, of a loneliness that stretched across centuries. It was a symphony of anguish, and in her broken, half-frozen state, Alara found herself not afraid, but strangely comforted. In the vast, indifferent darkness, she was not alone. She was surrounded by the echoes of sorrows as deep as her own. The whispers were her only guides in the desolate expanse. Their sorrowful chorus a thread she followed, not with sight, but with a deep instinctual pull. They led her away from the exposed ridges where the wind sought to flay her, down into a narrow, shadowed defile choked with scree and stubborn wind-gnarled pines. Her progress was a stumbling, half-blind shuffle, her body a vessel of pure agony, kept moving only by the desperate, fading ember of survival. The cold had sunk so deep it felt like a part of her, and the hunger was a dull, ever-present void. Then the whispers seemed to coalesce, their ethereal presence focusing on a dark, irregular scar in the cliff face ahead, half hidden behind a thorny thicket and a fall of ancient rock. It was not a path, not a welcoming entrance, but a fissure, a wound in the mountain's stone skin. A faint, musty draught, carrying the scent of dry dust and long stillness, whispered from the opening, a stark contrast to the biting, clean cold of the outside air. Pushing through the brittle thorns, ignoring the fresh scratches they etched on her arms, Alara squeezed into the narrow opening. The world outside vanished, replaced by an immediate, profound darkness and a silence that felt heavy and old.
The whispers
Fell silent, their work done. She took a few blind steps forward, her hands outstretched, and found the space opening around her. The amulet at her chest, which had pulsed with a sympathetic warmth in the presence of the whispers, now glowed with a steadier, though still faint, light. Its eerie green luminescence pushed back the absolute black, revealing the confines of her discovery. It was a cave, but clearly one that had been shaped by a human hand, however crude. The floor had been roughly leveled, the worst of the jagged protrusions knocked away. The walls bore the faint, ancient scars of tool marks, the slow, patient work of someone who had claimed this solitude not for a night but for a lifetime. It was a place of exile, chosen or enforced, and its inhabitant was long gone. In one corner, a pile of brittle animal bones lay neatly stacked, picked clean decades, perhaps centuries ago. Against another wall was a simple bed of dried moss and withered ferns, now little more than dust held together by memory. But it was the tools that held her gaze. A stone hammer, its handle long since rotted away, leaving only the painstakingly chipped head. A scraper made from a split rib bone, its edge worn smooth. A fire pit, a circle of blackened stones containing the ghost of ash so old it crumbled at a touch. This was not a home. It was a hermitage, the refuge of an outcast, someone who, like her, had been pushed to the very edge of the world and had clawed out a semblance of shelter in the stone. A profound sense of kinship, spanning untold years, settled over her. She was not the first to flee here. She was simply the latest in a long, lonely line of the unwanted. Collapsing onto the dusty bed of moss, she drew her knees to her chest. The cave was bitterly cold, but it was a dry cold, without the wind's knife edge. It was a profound, echoing silence. But it was a silence without the threat of footsteps or the murmur of betrayers. For the first time since she had clawed her way from the earth, she was within walls. They were stone, not wood, and they belonged to a dead stranger, but they were shelter. She was hidden. She was, for this moment, safe. The crude, abandoned tools of the long-dead hermit were a promise that life, however bare and brutal, could be sustained even here, in the heart of the unforgiving wild. Wrapping her arms around herself, the amulet's soft glow, the only light in the ancient dark, Alara allowed exhaustion to finally claim her. Sleeping the dreamless sleep of the utterly spent, within the stone womb of another forgotten soul, the cold of the cave was a deep, settling presence, seeping into her bones with the patience of stone. The fever came upon her not as a fire, but as an internal ice storm, locking her joints and setting her teeth chattering in a rhythm that echoed the drip of distant water. Hunger was a dull, hollow void, but it was the fever that owned her now, pulling her consciousness down into a turbulent, shadowed sea. The amulet still clutched in her stiff fingers, pulsed with a low, persistent warmth, its faint green light the only anchor in the swirling delirium. The darkness behind her eyelids did not bring rest, but a window. The cave walls dissolved, the musty scent of dust replaced by other smells. The salt tang of a distant sea, the dry heat of a sun-baked plain, the damp chill of a different forest. She was no longer Alara, huddled and starving. She was a tapestry of other lives, other sorrows, woven into her own by the thread of shared suffering. Were so a woman with hair the color of flame, her spirit as bright, standing on a windswept cliff. Her crime was knowledge, the healing herbs and midwifery skills that made her powerful in a world that demanded female submission. They called it witchcraft. Her sentence was the waves, the cold, grasping hands of the sea, pulling her down as her own village watched from the heights, their faces set in grim approval. The taste of salt water filled Alira's mouth, the crushing pressure of the deep, a phantom weight on her own chest. The vision shifted. She was a quiet girl with clever hands, her world the loom and the vibrant threads she wove into stories of far-off lands. Her desire was simple: to choose the apprentice she loved, a gentle cartographer, over the brutish soldier chosen by her clan to strengthen an alliance. Her defiance was met not with a trial, but with a swift, silent sentence. A dark sack over her head, the stifling dark of a buried cairn on a lonely moor, the sound of rocks being piled high sealing her fate. The suffocating closeness of the stones was her own tomb anew. The desperate scratch of her nails against rock, a mirror of her own frantic digging. Another, a queen of a forgotten matriarchal isle. Her authority usurped by her own son, swayed by foreign priests who preached of a weaker, more obedient goddess. Her punishment for refusing to relinquish her throne was to be walled alive within the foundations of her own palace, entombed in the dark to ensure the new order's stability. The vibration of footsteps on the floor above her head was a torment, the cheers of her people for her son a dirge in her ears. They came in a relentless procession, these echoes of women wronged, scholar buried with her scrolls for daring to teach, a warrior interred with her broken sword for leading a failed revolt, poet sealed in a barrel and cast into a river for verses that mocked a tyrant's vanity. Their faces, their times, their specific torments were different, but the core of their stories was identical to her own. A spark of defiance, a claim to autonomy, a voice that refused to be silenced. Met with the ultimate erasing silence of the earth, their fears became her fears. Their despair chilled her blood, their final gasping breaths were her own. But so too did their courage become hers, their refusal in those last moments to repent or beg, their silent, screaming fury at the injustice. Their unextinguished will, a spark that had somehow impossibly traveled through time and stone to find her. The amulet on her chest was not just a stone, it was a lodestone, drawing these ghosts of the unavenged, their collective anguish and their unbowed strength flowing into her. She awoke with a gasp, her body slick with a feverish sweat, the cave's darkness pressing close. The visions receded, leaving behind not fear, but a terrible, clarifying coldness. The shivering in her limbs was no longer from the fever or the chill alone. It was a resonance. She was not a singular tragedy. She was a refrain in an ancient, ongoing song of injustice. Her suffering was not unique. It was a pattern repeated across ages, a brutal ritual performed by fear upon courage. and in the deep echoing silence of the hermit's cave, that knowledge settled upon her, heavy and transformative. She was not just Alara who had escaped, she was one of many. And the weight of all their silent stories now lived within her. The fever broke not with a final violent shudder, but with a slow, steady receding, like a tide pulling back from a ravaged shore. The chilling sweat on Alara's skin cooled, and the phantoms that had haunted her delirium retreated into the corners of the cave. Their presence no longer visions, but a settled, grim knowledge deep in her bones. She was weak, hollowed out, her body a fragile shell, but her mind was preternaturally clear, washed clean by the storm of shared memory. The whispers that had guided her here, the chorus of sorrows on the wind, were no longer distant or indistinct. They were now a constant low hum in the periphery of her hearing, a tapestry of voices woven from centuries of grief. In the amulet's steady, eerie glow, she looked at the obsidian stone not as a simple heirloom, but as a key. Its warmth was no longer just a comfort. It was a connection, a live wire, humming with the energy of the countless souls whose final moments she had lived in her fever dream. The whispers clarified, their mournful sighs coalescing into a coherent, silent communication that flowed directly into her understanding. They were not random echoes, they were the unavenged. The knowledge unfolded within her not as words, but as a flood of absolute certainty. The amulet was a relic of immense age, a focal point created in a time when the old ways still remembered the power of a wronged spirit. It did not house the spirits themselves, but rather served as a conduit, a beacon that called to those who had been betrayed, silenced, and forgotten by history women. Stories were erased by the victors whose graves were unmarked, whose justice was never served. Their energy, their unresolved anguish, their furious will lingered in the world, drawn to the amulet's unique resonance, and now they were drawn to her. She was the perfect vessel. Her suffering was a fresh, bright wound that mirrored their own ancient pains. Her will to survive, her defiant crawl from the earth, was a spark they had not witnessed in an age. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense, but impressions, echoes of profound injustice, and they saw in Alara not just a kindred spirit, but a possibility. For centuries, the amulet had passed through hands unaware of its purpose, its wearers experiencing perhaps a faint sense of unease or strange luck. But none had been pushed to the absolute brink as she had been. None had been so perfectly broken open to receive the truth. They showed her glimpses, not full stories now, but fragments of their collective essence. A necklace of seashells dissolving in dark water, the feel of coarse sackcloth against a face, a taste of blood from a bitten lip, silent against the pain. The crushing weight of earth and stone, a universal experience that bound them all together across the vast expanse of years. They were the silenced, the ones whose names were scratched from records, whose lives were reduced to cautionary tales for other women who might dare to step out of line. They were the foundation upon which the fear-based order of villages like hers was built. Their erased existence as a warning meant to ensure compliance for generations to come. The amulet's secret was this: it was a link to a sisterhood of the betrayed. It was an archive of pain and a reservoir of fury. It connected her to every woman who had ever been sacrificed to the fragile ego of a cruel man, to the cold machinery of tradition, to the fear of those who stood by and did nothing. Their strength was not the strength of life, but the relentless, undying power of a wrong that had never been made right. They offered no comfort, no peace. They offered only the cold, sharp truth of their existence and the immense, dormant power of their collective will. In the deep silence of the cave, Alara understood. She was no longer just a fugitive. She was a nexus. The unavenged had found her, and their silence was finally over. The whispers were no longer an external chorus, but an internal tide, a rising swell of ancient grief and unspent fury that filled the hollows the fever had carved within her. They were not asking for solace or remembrance. Their purpose, honed over centuries of silent screaming, was far more potent, far more terrible. They did not want peace. They thirsted for redress. Their offering was not comfort but power cold, collective strength forged in the crucible of shared injustice, and the bitter knowledge of how the world truly worked. It was a transaction, laid bare in the silent language of shared suffering. Their energy, their will, their cunning, all that they had been denied in life, could be hers. It would mend her broken body, sharpen her dulled senses, and arm her with the cold wisdom of the betrayed. It was a weapon, and they were placing its hilt in her hand. But the price was absolute. In accepting, she would become their vessel, their instrument. Her personal desire for simple survival would be subsumed by their collective, singular hunger. Retribution, not just for herself, but for all of them. For the woman given to the sea, for the girl in the cairn, for the queen in the foundations, for every silenced voice whose echo now resonated within the obsidian stone. The choice was laid before her in the cave's absolute stillness. One path led to a slow, lonely death in the mountains, quiet fading that would be the final victory for Caius, for the elders, for the cruel logic that had buried her. It was the path of forgetting, of becoming just another anonymous tragedy swallowed by the indifferent wild. The other path was a descent into a different darkness. It was to take the hand offered by the legion of the wronged, to let their cold fire burn away the last of the girl she had been, the girl who believed in choice, in fairness, in the possibility of home. It was to embrace the monster they needed her to become, to wear their vengeance like a second skin. Her despair was the final key. It was not a weak, self-pitying thing, but a vast, cold ocean of understanding. She saw the world as they saw it, a place where justice was a myth told by the powerful to placate the weak, where mercy was a vulnerability to be exploited, where her spirit and her body were considered property to be disposed of when they became inconvenient. The love for her family, the memory of friendship, the hope for a future, these were the chains that had almost killed her. To be free, she had to sever them. To live, she had to become as ruthless as the world that had condemned her. There, in the hermit's cave, with the weight of centuries of silence pressing down upon her, Alara made her choice. It was not a shout of defiance, but a quiet, absolute surrender of the self. She opened the gates within her soul, the barriers that separated her pain from theirs. A silent yes echoed in the depths of her being. The effect was instantaneous and violent. A wave of cold power, vast and ancient, crashed into her. It was not a warmth, but an electric glacial energy that flooded her veins, scouring away the fever, the hunger, the bone-deep exhaustion. The raw, bloody flesh of her hands knitted together with an unnatural speed, leaving behind smooth, unmarked skin that felt both hers and not hers. Her senses sharpened to a painful degree, could hear the scuttle of a beetle in the far corner of the cave, smell the mineral temps of each individual stone, see the subtle variations in the absolute dark. The whispers did not fade. They settled inside her, a council of ghosts now residing in the palace of her mind. Their sorrow was her sorrow. Their fury was her fury. At her despair, Alara had accepted. She was no longer just a woman. She was a pact. She was the answered prayer of the forgotten, and her freedom would be bought with the currency of retribution. A coldness, deep and absolute, flooded her veins, a glacial tide that had nothing to do with the cave's chill. It was a power, ancient and sharp, pouring into the hollows of her being, scouring away the last vestiges of the fever, the gnawing hunger, the soul-deep exhaustion that had been her constant companions. It did not bring warmth, but a terrifying electric clarity, as if her very blood had been replaced with ice water and lightning. The transformation was not gentle. It was an invasion, a rewriting of her physical self by the collective will of the unavenged. Her body became a site of silent, impossible miracles. The raw, shredded flesh of her hands, which had clawed at unforgiving earth and stone, began to knit itself together. She watched, her breath caught in her throat, as torn skin smoothed over, as angry red inflammation faded to nothing, as the deep, aching wounds sealed without a scar. The process was swift and utterly silent, leaving behind hands that were whole, strong, and pale, yet felt alien to her, instruments of a will that was no longer solely her own. Her senses, once dulled by pain and starvation, sharpened to an almost painful intensity. The faint green glow of the amulet now illuminated every minute detail of the caved individual. Crystals in the granite, the delicate tracery of ancient lichen, the ghost of a spider's web trembling in a draft she could not feel. Her ears caught the skitter of a pebble shifting somewhere deep in the mountain's gut, the nearly silent beat of a moth's wings outside the cave mouth, the low humming frequency of the earth itself. She could smell the distinct mineral composition of each rock, the dry, papery scent of long-dead moss, and the lingering faint aroma of the hermit's despair, a scent decades old. A new awareness settled over her, a cold, calculating lens through which she viewed the world. The simple, desperate fears of the fugitive, of hunger, of cold, of capture, were burned away, replaced by a vast, icy certainty. She saw the patterns now, the brutal logic of power and fear that had condemned her and all the women who had come before. She understood the village not as her home, but as a system of control, its traditions weapons, its smiles, masks. The grief for her lost life was still there, but it was now a cold, hard stone in her chest, a foundation for something else entirely. She rose from the dusty floor, her movements fluid and unnaturally precise, devoid of the stiffness and pain that should have been her inheritance. She was no longer just Alara, the spirited young woman who had dared to say no. That person had been buried in the rocky pit. The thing that had clawed its way out and now stood in the hermit's cave was something else, a vessel. The sorrows of the unavenged were her sorrows, their fury, her fuel, their purpose, her compass. She was their instrument, forged in betrayal and tempered in the cold, dark silence of the earth. She was becoming their vengeance, and the transformation had only just begun. The cold clarity that now filled her was a sharper weapon than any blade. It honed her thoughts, stripped away hesitation, and mapped the world in terms of advantage and vulnerability. The whispers of the unavenged were no longer an external chorus, but an internal compass. Their collective memory, a library of human cruelty and its predictable patterns. They did not urge her to rage or to rash action. They guided her toward a cold, patient strategy. The first step was not confrontation, but observation. The hunt began not with a chase, but with a watchful stillness. Under the cover of a moonless night, she moved. Her descent from the high caves was no longer a stumbling, agonizing crawl, but a fluid, silent glide. Her enhanced senses painted the mountain path in vivid detail. Every loose stone was avoided. By every snapping twig anticipated and sidestepped. She was a shadow among shadows, her passage marked by nothing more than the faint stir of air in her wake. The village below was a constellation of pinprick lights, each one representing a life that had either condemned her or stood silent witness. They held no warmth for her now, only data. She settled on a high rocky outcrop that overlooked the village's outskirts, a place where the tree line gave way to tended fields. The air was cold and still, carrying the distant sounds of the settlement, the bark of a dog, the faint strains of a drunken song from the tavern, the rhythmic tread of the night watch on the palisade wall. She became a part of the rock she leaned against, her breathing shallow, her entire being focused on the scene below. The unavenged within her supplied a bitter, knowing commentary. They recognized the routines, the postures, the unspoken language of power and subservience. Her gaze, sharp as a hawk's, tracked the two guards patrolling the main gate. She noted their bored, predictable route. The moments they paused to share a joke or a pull from a hidden flask, the exact spots where the torchlight failed to reach, creating pools of deep shadow. She learned their rhythm, the cadence of their complacency. They believed the only threat came from outside the walls, from bandits or wild beasts. And the idea that a threat could come from within, from the very earth they stood upon, was beyond their comprehension. Then her focus shifted. Guided by a cold, burning ember of her own memory, amplified by the shared fury of the spirits, she found the smaller, well-kept cottage near the edge of the square, Lysias's home. She watched as a figure Jaime emerged to dump a bucket of waste behind the house. His movements were quick, nervous. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, his eyes scanning the darkness, not with a guard's vigilance, but with the furtive guilt of a betrayer waiting for his reward, or perhaps for his comeuppance. She watched him, her expression unchanging, a predator memorizing the habits of its prey. Next, her attention was drawn to the largest structure, the chieftain's hall. Even at this hour, light blazed from its high windows. She saw Caius himself emerge onto the porch, his broad frame unmistakable. He was laughing, clapping another man on the back, his voice carrying on the still night air in boastful slurred fragments. She caught the words. Taught her, never defy, in a burst of crude laughter. He showed no remorse, no unease. Innate, only the blustering pride of a man who believed his authority was absolute and his actions beyond consequence. He was the embodiment of the disease the unavenged had shown her, arrogance rooted in unchallenged power. She did not move. She did not feel the hot rush of anger she might have once felt. Instead, she felt a profound, chilling calm. She was not gathering information for an escape or for a plea for mercy. She was learning the routines of her betrayers for a different purpose entirely. She was studying the strengths and weaknesses of her quarry, understanding the rhythms of their lives so she might disrupt them in the most devastating way possible. The first hunt was a silent, patient gathering of intelligence. And as the moon began its slow ascent, painting the world in silver and shadow, Alara, vessel of the forgotten, turned away from the village lights and melted back into the darkness, her mission clear, her purpose forged in cold fire. The moon was a sliver of bone in the star-strewn sky, casting just enough light to etch the world in shades of silver and ink. Alara moved through the sleeping village not as a woman, but as an extension of the shadows themselves. The enhanced senses granted by the unavenged painted a detailed map in her mind, the scent of damp. Thatched the sound of a child's restless sigh from within a cottage, the slow rhythmic breathing of the few souls still awake behind shuttered windows. Her path was a silent, predetermined line, avoiding the bored patrols of the guards with an ease that felt less like skill and more like fate. Lysias's croft was dark, a silent hummock against the darker line of the forest. The memory of false warmth and a betrayer's calculating eyes was a cold ember in her chest, but it did not burn with anger. It was a data point, a confirmed weakness in the world's fabric that needed to be pulled. She did not approach the door. Instead, she circled to the rear, to the small, single window of the sleeping loft. The shutter was poorly fastened, a simple wooden latch on the inside. From a fold in her ragged tunic, she produced a long, thin sliver of bone she had taken from the hermit Escava tool, from one outcast to be used upon another. A deft, silent movement slipped it between the frame and the shutter, lifting the latch with a faint, almost inaudible click. She flowed inside, her landing on the rough floorboards utterly soundless. The room was thick with the smells of unwashed wool, wood smoke, and the sour temps of fierce sweat. Lysias lay on his narrow bed, one arm thrown over his face, his breathing deep and regular. In sleep, the avaricious calculation was gone from his features, replaced by the simpler face of the boy she had once known. The sight stirred nothing in her. That boy was as dead as the girl who had trusted him. She did not wake him with a touch or a sound. She simply stood over him, a statue of shadow and silent judgment, and allowed her presence to permeate his dreams. The temperature in the small room dropped several degrees, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. A low, subsonic hum, the collective discontent of the unavenged, vibrated through the very air. Lysias's breathing hitched. A frown creased his brow, twitched, mumbling in his sleep, a name that might have been hers. Then his eyes snapped open. It took a moment for them to adjust to the gloom, to resolve the pale, still figure standing beside his bed. When recognition came, it was not with a start, but with a slow, dawning horror that froze him utterly. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His eyes, wide and white in the darkness, were locked on hers, which reflected the faint starlight with an unnatural, glacial calm. He saw no anger there, no hatred. He saw only a depthless, ancient cold, a void that promised nothing, not even the mercy of rage. He saw the woman he had condemned to the earth, standing whole and silent in his home, and understood that the laws of life and death had been suspended for her. This was not a person, it was a consequence. Alara moved then. Her hand, cold and strong, clamped over his mouth before he could muster a scream. She held him there, not with brute force, but with an immovable, terrifying certainty. With her other hand, she produced the sliver of bone. It was not a weapon, not truly. It was a needle, a tool for marking. He struggled feebly, a trapped animal, his terror a palpable scent in the room. She ignored it, her movements precise and detached. On his forehead, just above the bridge of his nose, she etched a single simple symbol. It was not from her village's language, but from the shared memory of the unavenged and ancient mark for betrayer, for one who trades trust for coin. The scratch was shallow, but it beaded with blood, a dark line in the moonlight. She released him, scrambled backward against the wall, his breath coming in ragged, silent sobs, his hands flying to his forehead, feeling the wet, accusing line. He stared at her, his body trembling uncontrollably. She did not speak. Words were for the living, for those who could be reasoned with or threatened. Her message was beyond words. Apt, she was the embodiment of his guilt, a walking retribution that had passed through stone and earth to find him. She held his gaze for one more long, chilling moment, ensuring the image of her, the cold touch, the mark was seared into his soul forever. Then she turned and slipped back out the window, melting into the night as silently as she had come. She left him there, unharmed in body, but utterly broken in spirit, huddled and weeping in the dark. He would not sound the alarm. He would live the rest of his days in terrified silence, watching every shadow. A walking testament to the fact that some ghosts did not haunt burial grounds. They visited you in your home and left their mark upon your skin. The story would spread, of course, in terrified whispers. The message was not for him alone. It was for the entire village. The buried woman was walking, and she was keeping a list. The cold clarity that now governed Ilara's being did not extinguish all emotion, but it channeled them into a deep, silent river flowing beneath a surface of ice. There was one last thread, one final connection to the girl she had been, that she needed to sever not with anger, but with a witness's cold, accepting gaze. Under the cloak of a mist-shrouded dawn, she found herself drawn not to the seats of power or the homes of her betrayers, but to the small, well-tended garden behind her family's cottage. She positioned herself within the skeletal branches of an old, gnarled hawthorn tree on the neighboring hill, its bare limbs offering a perfect veil. From here she could see the entire plot, the neat rows of winter vegetables, the herb bed now brown and dormant, and the figure kneeling within it. Her mother, Althea, was a ghost of the woman she had been. Her movements, as she pulled stubborn weeds, were slow, mechanical, devoid of their former capable grace. Her shoulders were perpetually hunched, as if bearing an invisible weight that pressed her closer to the earth she tended. Even from this distance, Ilara could see the profound change. Her mother's hair, once a rich, dark brown streaked with silver, seemed to have turned entirely gray, a stark white crown around a face that was now a roadmap of grief. Her eyes, when she occasionally looked up, were hollow, fixed on some middle distance that held no comfort, only a bottomless well of guilt. The village had not forgiven her for being the mother of a cursed woman. Lara watched as a neighbor woman approached the low stone wall that bordered the property, a basket on her arm. She did not open the gate or offer a greeting. Instead, she placed the basket on the wall, nodded once, a gesture devoid of warmth, and turned away quickly, as if afraid the disgrace might be contagious. It was not kindness. It was the delivery of alms to an untouchable. Althea did not acknowledge it. She simply continued her weeding, her head bowed lower, accepting the charity and the shunning with the same numb resignation. Later, Ilara's father, Lorcan, emerged from the cottage. He stood for a moment on the doorstep, his own face a mask of grim endurance. He looked at his wife, a complex mixture of pity, frustration, and shared shame in his eyes. He said something, his voice a low rumble that did not carry up the hill. Althea did not look up. She gave no sign that she had even heard him. After a moment, Lorcan's shoulders slumped, and he turned away, heading toward the village square alone, leaving his wife to her solitary penance amongst the leafless plants. This was the true cost, the collateral damage of her defiance. Her mother was being buried alive in a different way, walled into a tomb of solitude and blame, punished for a daughter's crime. The love that had once filled this small plot of land had been replaced by a heavy, silent desolation. Althea's grief was a physical presence, a shroud that wrapped around her and separated her from the world. Ilara watched, and the coldness within her did not waver, but it deepened, taking on a new, more sorrowful density. This was the price of the world's cruel logic. It did not just destroy the defiant, meticulously dismantled everyone who loved them. There was no rage left in her for this, only a profound, icy sadness. Her mother's tears had been the last warmth to touch her in the dark, and now she was condemned to an eternity of them. Ilara understood then that there was no going back, no redemption that could ever mend this. Her mother's grief was the final silent seal on her own tomb, confirming that the woman named Ilara was truly gone, leaving only the vessel of the unavenged watching from the cold shadows, her heart a stone of frozen sorrow. From her vantage point, high in the arms of a gnarled oak at the forest's edge, Ilara watched the heart of the village with the detached focus of a predator. The sun was high, casting sharp, short shadows, and the central square bustled with the mundane rhythm of daily life. Her gaze, honed by the cold clarity of the unavenged, swept over the scene, dismissing the farmers, the traders, the children at play. Her attention was a spear point, and it found its target with unerring precision. Caius held court outside the tavern, sprawled on a rough-hewn bench like a king on a borrowed throne. A tankard of ale was clutched in his meaty hand, and a circle of his sycophants, lesser sons of influential families and guards, off-duty clustered around him, their laughter too loud, their postures eager for approval. He was the sun around which their petty world orbited, and he basked in the heat of their admiration. It was the anniversary of her sentencing, fact she knew not from any village calendar, but from the cold, humming knowledge of the spirits within her. And Caius was marking the occasion not with somber reflection, but with a boastful performance. Even from a distance, she could see the familiar, swaggering set of his shoulders, the way he threw his head back when he laughed a sound that carried across the square, sharp and devoid of true humor. He was recounting a story, his voice a confident, carrying baritone meant for an audience larger than his immediate circle. He gestured broadly, painting pictures in the air with his free hand. Ilara did not need to hear the words to understand their meaning. The spirits supplied the context, their cold fury a lens that sharpened the scene to painful clarity. She saw the way he slapped his thigh at the punchline, the way his followers roared with obliging laughter. She saw him lean forward, his expression turning conspiratorial, then grimly satisfied, as he undoubtedly detailed the lesson he had been forced to teach. He would be speaking of her defiance, not as a personal wound, but as a threat to the entire social order that he, heroically, had quashed. He would be framing her burial, not as a monstrous act, but as a necessary, even dutiful, piece of civic maintenance. There was no remorse in his posture, no shadow of guilt in his booming voice. There was only pride, a profound, unshakable arrogance in his own authority, and the brutal example he had made. He was not a man haunted by a ghost. He was a man proud of a trophy. Her death was a feather in his cap, a story to be told over ale to prove his strength and his unwavering commitment to the traditions that kept him in power. He showed no recognition of her humanity, of her spirit, of the life he had extinguished. She was a problem he had solved, a disruptive element he had smoothed over, and he took open. Swaggering credit for the village's continued, peaceful existence. The sight should have filled her with a hot, blinding rage. Instead, it settled within her as a cold, absolute certainty. This was the enemy in its purest form, not just cruelty, but a profound, unthinking arrogance that believed its own violence was not only justified, but laudable. Caius felt no stain upon his soul, because he believed his soul was spotless, his actions righteous. He slept soundly, ate heartily, and boasted openly, his conscience clear, his position secure. As she watched him drain his tankard and call for another, surrounded by his nodding, laughing court, Ilara felt the final brittle thread of any past affection or shared history snap. The man was a hollow shell, filled with pride and power, a perfect instrument of the system the unavenged had shown her. His arrogance was his armor, and it was impregnable to reason, to pity, to any human appeal. It could only be met with a force as absolute and unfeeling as the justice he had so proudly delivered. The cold purpose within her solidified, hard and sharp as a diamond. His pride would be his downfall. It was the flaw in his armor, and she would exploit it with the patience of the grave itself. The village, once a place of predictable rhythms and firmly held certainties, began to curdle with a new and unsettling dread. It started subtly, like a sickness working its way through the blood. The tale of Lysias's encounter, whispered behind cupped hands and closed doors, was the first seed. A ghost, they said, Not of mist and memory, but of solid, chilling flesh, with eyes that held the cold of the deep earth and a touch that froze the blood. She had marked him, they murmured, not with a wound of the body, but with a symbol of old, forgotten power, brand for betrayers. This single story, terrifying in its specificity, found fertile ground in the recent unspoken anxieties of the people. The burial grounds, a place already steeped in superstition, became the focal point. A young shepherd, hurrying his flock home as dusk fell, swore he saw a pale figure moving between the older, moss-covered cairns, a figure that did not walk so much as glide, and which vanished when he blinked. A pair of lovers seeking privacy in the moonlit grove near Tay. The sight fled in a panic, babbling about a sorrowful collective sighing that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath their feet. A sound that killed all passion and replaced it with a bone-deep terror. Each account was different in its details, yet eerily similar in its essence. It was never a full, clear sighting, always a glimpse, a sound, a feeling. A flicker of movement in the peripheral vision that was gone when one turned to look at chill that was out of place. On a still night, the faint, acrid smell of disturbed earth, where no digging had been done. The stories multiplied, fed by fear and imagination, evolving with each telling. The figure became a vengeful spirit, a draugr risen from its grave, its heart burning with cold fury against the living who had wronged it. The burial grounds, once merely a place of endings, became a locus of dark power. Villagers began to avoid the path that skirted its edge, even in broad daylight. Mothers pulled their children closer when the topic was mentioned, using the ghost of the buried woman as a new, more potent threat to ensure obedience. Doors were barred a little earlier at night, and glances over shoulders became more frequent. The rational explanations of the elders' animals in the dusk, the wind playing tricks, the guilt of a superstitious people rang hollow against the cold, certain fear that had taken root in the community's heart. Unease became a fog that blanketed the village, and superstition its native tongue. Old protective charms, long neglected, were dug out from chests and hung above doorways. Small offerings of bread and milk-hold customs from a time when the spirits of the dead were appeased. Not feared began to appear at the crossroads at night, placed by trembling hands. The world had been turned upside down. Earth, the ultimate source of their life and sustenance, had become a thing of dread, capable of giving back what it had been given. The punished had become the punisher, and her territory was the very ground in which they had buried her. A collective shudder ran through the village, silent acknowledgement that the old rules no longer applied, and that the price of their justice was now walking among them, cloaked in shadow and spreading fear like a plague. The unease that had settled over the village like a shroud found its way into the one place that had always prided itself on reason and order, the great hall of the elders. The air inside, usually thick with the smell of old wood and pipe smoke, now seemed charged with a nervous energy, a stark contrast to the grim certainty that had presided over Alara's trial. The same men who had sat in stern judgment weeks before now shifted uncomfortably on their benches, their faces illuminated by the guttering torchlight, etched with new lines of worry and doubt. The debate was not a measured discussion of policy. It was a fractious, fearful argument that echoed under the high-shadowed beams. On one side sat the old guard, led by Elder Torvin, his voice a dry rasp of dismissal. He saw the stories as the predictable result of a guilty conscience and idle minds. A woman was buried, the matter was closed. These whispers of ghosts and walking dead were the fancies of simple folk, a superstition to be ignored, lest it be mistaken for legitimacy. He spoke of maintaining order, of projecting strength, of not giving credence to the hysterical mutterings of women and shepherds. To acknowledge the sightings was to admit a crack in the foundation of their world, possibility he refused to entertain. But across the semicircle, a different fear had taken root. Elder Kale, once a firm supporter of the chieftain's harsh justice, now sat hunched, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. His voice was low, strained, his eyes darting toward the hall's heavy doors, as if expecting something to step through. He spoke not of logic, but of omens. He recalled half-remembered tales from his own grandfather's time, stories of curses falling upon villages that dealt in unjust deaths. What if the burial had been an affront to the old gods of the earth? What if the girl's spirit had not been laid to rest, but had been angered, transformed into something that now walked in resentment. His arguments were not political, they were primal, born of a deep, superstitious terror that the natural order had been violated, and the village was now reaping the consequences. Other voices joined the fray, a cacophony of rising anxiety. Some spoke of bad luck already manifesting a blight on the early wheat shoots, 2 stillborn calves in a single week. They connected these events to the sightings with the absolute certainty of the deeply frightened. The stories from the burial ground were not just stories. They were symptoms of a sickness that had infected the village itself, a moral rot that had begun with the sentence they had all endorsed. Their guilt, once buried beneath a veneer of necessity, now clawed its way to the surface, wearing the mask of a spectral woman. The debate circled, never finding purchase. It was reasoned against fear, arrogance against guilt. They could not agree on what the apparition was, a ghost, a curse, a collective madness, but they could all agree on the effect it was having. The village was paralyzed by a dread they could not fight with swords or laws. The authority of the elders, once absolute, was being undermined not by a rival power, but by a whisper on the wind, a shadow in the periphery. Their meeting ended not with a decision, but with a tense, unresolved silence. They filed out into the twilight, each man alone with his thoughts, their unity fractured, their confidence shaken. The specter they argued about had already won its first victory, not by appearing, but by dividing the very council that had created her. Fear, once a subtle poison in the village's veins, now coursed through its heart with the force of a raging fever. The elders' fractured debate had resolved into a desperate, unified need for action, action that might stem the tide of dread. Reason had been abandoned at the altar of superstition, and in its place stepped the village priest, a gaunt, fearful man named Alaric, whose faith was a brittle thing, easily swayed by the tremors of panic shaking his congregation. His counsel, delivered in a hushed, tremulous voice within the smoky confines of the great hall, is not one of comfort, but of capitulation to the village's darkest instincts. He spoke not of the gods of light and order, but of the older, hungrier spirits of the earth, the ones who demanded payment for spilled blood and disturbed rest. The stories were not mere fancy, he insisted, his eyes wide with a terror he claimed was piety. They were a warning. The spirit was not at peace. It was angry, restless, and its displeasure was manifesting in the blighted crops and the pall of fear over the people. To ignore it was to invite a greater catastrophe. The solution he proposed was ancient, brutal, and spoke directly to the guilt festering in the elders' hearts. A ritual of appeasement, sacrifice not of an animal, but of something valuable, something pure, offered at the site of the transgression to soothe the angry spirit and restore balance. It was a practice from a darker, more primal time. A ghost of tradition, they had all believed, was long buried. But fear has a way of exhuming what reason has interred. The decision was made with a grim, collective sigh of relief. It was easier to perform a ritual than to confront their own complicity, easier to blame a restless spirit than to admit their justice had been a monstrous error. The weight of their fear was transferred into the mechanics of ceremony. Orders were given. The prized white lamb from the chieftain's own flock was selected, its fleece a symbol of purity. Sacred herbs were gathered, their bitter scent meant to cleanse and pacify. A time was set for dusk, the liminal hour when the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest. The news spread through the village not as a decree, but as a shudder. A somber, fearful anticipation replaced the chaotic panic. Doors remained shut, and faces peered from behind shutters as the procession formed. The elders led the way, their faces masks of solemn duty that could not conceal the unease in their eyes. Behind them came Priest Alaric, clutching a ceremonial knife whose bone handle was worn smooth by generations of disuse, his prayers a low, frantic mumble. The chosen lamb was led on a rope, its gentle, unknowing eyes a stark contrast to the grim purpose of the men surrounding it. They moved toward the burial grounds, a silent funereal march. The site itself seemed to watch their approach, the older cairns like silent judges. The newer, disturbed earth of Alara's grave, a dark, accusing wound at its center. The air grew still and heavy, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Torches were lit, their flames casting long, dancing shadows that made the familiar stones seem alien and menacing. The stage was set for a plea to the darkness, an offering to a ghost they had created, a desperate attempt to bury their fear by once again resorting to the very earth that had started it all. Dusk bled into the bruised purple of twilight, and the burial grounds, a place already heavy with memory and dread, became a stage for desperate superstition. The air was unnaturally still, the usual evening chorus of insects and birds hushed, as if the world itself watched with bated breath. A semicircle of villagers, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering torchlight, stood at a respectful, fearful distance from the elders and the priest. The scene was a grotesque pantomime of piety, the flames casting long, leaping shadows that twisted the solemn expressions into masks of terror. Priest Alaric stood before the raw, rocky scar of Ilara's grave, his voice a reedy tremolo as he chanted words so old their meaning had been lost to everyone. But the fear that gave them power, the white lamb, sensing the tension in the hands that held it, bleated once, a small, pitiful sound that was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The ceremonial knife in Alaric's hand caught the torchlight, its bone handle a yellowed, grim relic. The elders stood behind him, their heads bowed, not in prayer, but in a shared, shamed apprehension. This was not faith. It was a transaction with the darkness, an attempt to buy back their peace with a symbol and a blade. It was at the moment Alaric raised the knife, his chant reaching a quivering crescendo, that the shadows at the edge of the burial ground stirred. Not with the wind, for there was none, but with a deliberate, silent motion. From between the hulking shapes of two ancient, moss-covered cairns, she emerged. The chanting died in Alaric's throat. The knife trembled in his uplifted hand. A collective sharp intake of breath hissed from the crowd, followed by a silence so profound the thud of a dropped torch onto the soft earth sounded like a thunderclap. Ilara stood at the edge of the torchlight, a figure woven from nightmare and memory. The pale, spectral green glow that had illuminated her tomb now seemed to emanate from her very skin, casting her features in a ghastly, unearthly light. She was clad in the tattered, soil-stained rags of her burial shroud, the fabric hanging from her frame like the rotting cerements of a corpse too long in the ground. But it was her eyes that held them, that froze the blood in their veins and stole the air from their lungs. They burned with a cold inner fire, a light that was not a reflection of the torches but something far older and more terrible. There was no recognition in them, no humanity, only a depthless, ancient fury that seemed to look through them and into the blackness of their own guilty souls. She did not advance with a specter's glide or a monster's charge. She simply stood there, a silent, terrible accusation made flesh. Her presence alone enough to shatter the ritual and strip the elders of their fragile authority. The lamb, forgotten, let out another soft bleat, the only sound in a world that had seemingly stopped turning. The sacrifice they had planned for a ghost was now confronted by the very real, very wronged woman they had created. Their carefully constructed ceremony crumbled into dust before her burning, silent gaze. The silence she brought with her was heavier than any shovelful of earth, more suffocating than the deepest tomb. It was a presence, a weight that pressed down on the gathering, stilling every breath, freezing every limb. The priest's knife hung useless in the air, his arm trembling not from effort but from a terror so profound it threatened to unmake him. The elders, those pillars of supposed wisdom and authority, seemed to shrink, their solemn masks crumbling to reveal the raw fear beneath. Then she spoke. The voice that emerged was not her own. It was a chorus, a dissonant symphony of whispers layered over a core of glacial calm. It held the salt-cracked despair of the woman given to the sea, the stifled fury of the girl sealed in the cairn, the regal indignation of the queen entombed in her own palace, and the cold, clear certainty of Elara's own wrongs. It was the voice of the unavenged, given a single terrible mouthpiece. She did not shout. The words were measured, precise, and carried on the still air with an unnatural clarity that etched them into the minds of every listener. She began not with threats, but with a listing of crimes. She named each elder in turn, her burning gaze fixing upon them, and laid bare their injustices. She spoke of the land seized from a struggling family under a false pretense of debt, a decision made by Elder Torvin that had driven a man to despair. She recounted the swift, brutal judgment passed on a young boy caught stealing bread to feed his siblings. A sentence of losing a hand, championed by Elder Kale for the sake of deterrence. She detailed the quiet, cowardly votes, the compromises made for power. The lives broken not in grand acts of evil, but in small, calculated choices that upheld a system of fear. And then she turned her attention to Caius, who stood at the forefront of the elders, his face a frozen mask of shock and dawning, incredulous rage. Her voice, the chorus of the wronged, wove his story into the tapestry of their own, his casual cruelties, his abuse of power, his belief that his desire was a command. These were not the isolated actions of a flawed man, but the perfect expression of the disease that infected the entire village leadership. She spoke of her own trial not as a singular event, but as the logical endpoint of their corruption, the moment their casual injustices culminated in a definitive, monstrous act. She was not accusing them. She was testifying. She was the evidence they had tried to bury, now risen to hold them accountable in a court of their own deepest fears. Her words stripped away their justifications, their traditions, their authority, leaving only the naked, ugly truth of their actions. The ritual had been meant to appease a ghost. Instead, it had summoned a prosecutor. And her evidence was the unvarnished history of their own sins, spoken in a voice from the grave. The silence that followed her testimony was not the quiet of a concluded speech, but the breathless, suspended stillness of a world waiting for an axe to fall. The torch flame seemed to gutter lower, as if cowed by the weight of the truth she had unleashed. The villagers, who had come to witness a sacrifice, now found themselves witnesses to a damnation. Their faces, pale in the erratic light, were no longer just afraid. They were confused, unsettled, their certainties crumbling like old mortar. El-Auror, the being that wore her face, turned her burning gaze from the stricken elders and let it sweep over the crowd. The collective voice within her softened from its prosecutorial edge, taking on a tone of devastating, sorrowful clarity. She spoke now not of the elders' corruption, but of her own story. She told them of the air pocket, the fissure in the rock, the desperate, bloody climb through earth, turned to mud by the very rain they now remembered with a shudder. She described the cold of the mountain, the betrayal at Lysias's croft, the hunger that had gnawed at her sanity. She made them feel the despair that had been her only companion. But it was the next revelation that turned their fear into something darker, more volatile. She spoke of the council's secret fear, their private debates held behind the hall's closed doors. She revealed their plan for this very ritual, not as an act of faith, but as a political calculation. A desperate stunt to placate a superstitious populace and maintain their eroding control. She laid bare their cowardice, their willingness to spill more blood, if that of an innocent beast too, avoid facing the real source of the village's sickness, their own unjust rule. She did not need to point a finger at the trembling priest Alaric. Own guilt was a visible stain upon him. She simply recited word for word the private counsel he had given the elders, the way he had stoked their fears with tales of old hungry spirits to provide them with a solution that required no introspection, no admission of wrongdoing. His faith was exposed as a tool, his ritual a hollow performance. The effect on the crowd was a palpable shift. The unified front of superstitious dread fractured, replaced by a low, angry murmur. The fear did not leave them, but it changed direction. It was no longer focused on the spectral figure before them, but on the men who had led them to this precipice. They had been afraid of a ghost, but she had shown them the true monsters stood among them, clad in the robes of authority. Their terror curdled into a burning sense of betrayal. They trusted these men to keep them safe, to uphold justice. And instead, they had been governed by corruption and cowardice, all the way down to a young woman's living grave. Doubt, that most dangerous of seeds, took root in their hearts, and anger was the sun that made it grow. The villagers' eyes, once wide with fear of her, now narrowed as they turned toward the elders, seeing them not as wise leaders, but as fallible, frightened men who had tried to bury their mistakes first with earth and now with a sacrificial lamb. The ambush was complete. She had not attacked them with claw or weapon. She had ambushed their conscience, and the victory was total. The fear in the air now belonged to the elders, as they looked out and saw not a compliant flock, but a gathering storm of disillusioned, angry faces, their own authority dissolving in the face of a truth that could no longer be buried. The silence that had held the crowd in thrall shattered as Caius's rage, a beast goaded beyond endurance, finally broke its chains. the damning truths, the unveiled cowardice. The shift in the crowd's allegiance it was an intolerable assault on the foundation of his world. His face pale with shock moments before, flooded with a violent purpling fury. The fear in his eyes was not of her, but of the crumbling of his absolute authority. It transformed instantly into a blind, destructive wrath. With a roar that was more animal than human, he charged. He did not think of strategy or the unnatural stillness of his target. He saw only the woman who had humiliated him, the ghost who dared to challenge his reality, and he sought to obliterate her with the sheer brute force that had always been his final answer. He was a bull seeing red, his massive frame hurtling across the short distance, his hands curled into fists meant to pummel, to break, to silence. Ilara did not move. She did not flinch or raise a hand in her own defense. She simply stood, a pale statue in her rags, her eyes holding that same depthless, ancient calm. It was not a challenge. It was an utter indifference, a void that his rage could not fill. As he closed the final steps, his boot came down upon the uneven stones of the ritual altar, hastily assembled pile of flat rocks meant to hold the sacrificial lamb. The spirit's power that flowed through her was not a weapon she wielded, but a force that manipulated the world's subtle balances. It was a whisper of influence, a nudge against the precise point of structural weakness in the crude stone pile. The rock he stepped on shifted, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough. The imbalance traveled through the hastily stacked altar like a shockwave. There was a sharp, grating crack of stone on stone. Then, with a slow, grinding inevitability that was far more terrifying than a sudden collapse, the entire structure gave way. Caius's roar of fury turned into a grunt of surprise as his footing vanished. The stones slid and tumbled, not in a violent explosion, but in a deliberate, crushing avalanche. A heavy capstone, the centerpiece of the altar, rocked once, then fell with a terrible final weight. It struck him across the shoulders and head, driving him to the ground with a sickening, wet thud. The sound was not loud, but it was horribly definitive in the absolute silence that followed. The cascade of smaller rocks pattered down around him, covering his legs and back in a shroud of limestone. For a moment there was only the settling dust and the sight of his hand, twitching once, then lying still amidst the rubble. He was not struck down by her hand, but by the accidental collapse of the very altar his own fear had demanded. His own rage, his own Mamu charge, had been his undoing. Justice was poetic, cold, and utterly absolute. The crowd stared, their collective breath held, at the still form of the chieftain's son, buried not by earth, but by the consequences of his own arrogance. A seemingly chance event that felt, to every terrified soul present, like the coldest, most calculated retribution imaginable. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, Chieftain Bourne stood frozen, his mind refusing to assemble the shattered pieces of the scene before him. The roar of his son, the grating collapse of stone, the final sickening thud, they were fragments of a nightmare that could not be real. Then his eyes, wide with denial, found Caius's form, motionless and half-buried beneath the rubble of the ritual altar he had sanctioned. The world seemed to drain of color and sound, narrowing to that single, horrifying point. A sound escaped him, a strangled, wordless gasp that was the death rattle of his own reign. All of it, the power, the legacy, the unchallenged authority that had been his for decades, was built upon the foundation of his son, his heir, the continuation of his bloodline, and his brutal vision for their future. Caius was not just his son. He was his monument, his vindication, his immortality. And now that monument lay broken, crushed by a pile of rocks in a foolish ceremony meant to placate a specter that had just proven herself terrifyingly real. His gaze, blurred with the first hot tears of a loss too vast to comprehend, lifted from his son's body to the figure who had caused it all. Ilara stood unmoved, her expression unchanged, her eyes still holding that ancient glacial calm. In her silent, terrible presence, he did not see a woman or a ghost. He saw the embodiment of his own folly. He saw the absolute failure of his power. He had ordered her buried to make an example, to demonstrate the inviolable strength of his rule, and in doing so, he had not killed her. He had unleashed this. He had authored the force that had just destroyed his entire world. The shock was a physical blow, a massive, constricting pressure in his chest that stole the air from his lungs. The terror that followed was not for his own life, but for the utter void that now awaited his lineage, his name, his everything. The arrogant certainty that had been the core of his being crumbled into dust, leaving a howling emptiness. He saw the faces of the villagers, no longer fearful of the spirit, but now staring at him with a dawning revolutionary anger. He saw the shattered resolve in the eyes of his elders. His authority, his fear-based order, had evaporated in the space of a few minutes, exposed as a hollow sham by a voice from the grave. The pressure in his chest intensified, a terrible vice-like agony that radiated down his left arm. His vision swam, the torches blurring into streaks of orange light against a descending darkness. He clutched at the front of his tunic, his mouth working soundlessly. The world tilted on its axis. The last thing he saw was the pale, unforgiving face of the woman he had condemned. And the last thing he knew was the absolute, utter ruin of all he had ever built. Then the darkness claimed him, Chieftain Borin, the unassailable ruler, the stern father, the architect of a living burial, crumpled to the ground without a sound, felled not by a weapon, but by the catastrophic shock of a world unmade and a reign ended. The silence that followed the chieftain's collapse was more profound than any that had come before, a vacuum of sound and sense that swallowed the burial grounds whole. A long moment no one moved, no one breathed. The world had been upended, its axis shattered, and the villagers stood as statues in the flickering torchlight, their minds struggling to process the cataclysm that had unfolded in mere minutes. Then the spell broke. A woman's scream tore through the night, high and sharp, a needle of pure panic that punctured the collective stupor. It was as if a dam had burst. The crowd, once a unified body of fear and superstition, erupted into chaos. The scene dissolved into a swirling, shouting mass of confusion and terror. Some surged forward, not toward Alara, but toward the fallen forms of their leaders Caius buried in stone. The chieftain motionless on the earth, driven by a frantic, disbelieving need to help, to undo what could not be undone. Others recoiled, scrambling backward, tripping over roots and stones in their blind urge to flee the cursed ground, their cries adding to the cacophony. The elders, those pillars of the old order, found themselves adrift in the storm they had unleashed. Their authority, which moments before had been merely shaken, was now utterly annihilated. Elder Torvin shouted for order, his voice a reedy, desperate whistle against the gale of chaos, but no one listened. Elder Kale simply stood, his face ashen, his body trembling uncontrollably, staring at the spot where the chieftain had fallen as if witnessing the end of the world itself. The guards, trained to respond to threats from without, were paralyzed by a threat from within their own beliefs. They looked from the chaotic crowd to the pale, unmoving figure of Alara, who stood like the eye of the hurricane. Untouched by the madness around her, to approach her was to invite the same fate that had befallen Caius and his father. Their loyalty to a now-dead chieftain warred with a primal, superstitious terror. Their swords remained in their scabbards. Their duty was to a world that no longer existed. And then the anger came. It rose from the confusion like a beast, fueled by the damning truths Alara had spoken. The fear of the supernatural was eclipsed by a hotter, more immediate rage, the rage of the betrayed. A man who had lost his land to Elder Torvin's decree picked up a stone from the fallen altar. A woman whose son had been maimed under Elder Kale's judgment spat on the ground at his feet, her curses lost in the din, but her hatred plain for all to see. The old order was not just broken, it was being torn apart by the hands it had oppressed. The invisible chains of fear and tradition that had bound the village for generations snapped. The spectacle of their leaders' hypocrisy, their cowardice, and their sudden, ignominious fall had awakened a sleeping giant, the collective anger of a people who had long been told their suffering was necessary for the greater good. They saw now that the greater good had only ever been the good of the few. There were no leaders left to follow, no rules left to obey. The world they had known was over, and in its place was a raw, screaming void, waiting to be filled by whatever came next. The chaos swirled around her, a maelstrom of panicked cries, angry shouts, and the raw, unfiltered sound of a world breaking apart. Alara stood at its still center, a statue of ice in the torchlit storm. Ice. The cold power that had sustained her, the chorus of the unavenged that had filled her veins, began to recede, not with a rush, but with a slow, steady ebb, like a tide pulling back from a ravaged shore. The voices, the furious, sorrowful symphony that had been her counsel and her compass, fell silent, their purpose fulfilled, their vengeance exacted. She looked upon the ruin she had wrought, the chieftain felled by the shock of his own world's collapse, the village, a tapestry of fear and complicity, now unraveling into a screaming, leaderless mob. It was the absolute, unforgiving reckoning the unavenged had craved. The price extracted for every silenced voice, every erased story, every life crushed beneath the weight of tradition and fear. And it was hollow. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, no surge of power. She had destroyed her destroyers, but in doing so, she had annihilated any possibility of return. The home she had once longed for, with every fiber of her being, was not just gone, was unmade, its foundations exposed as rotten, its heart revealed as corrupt. The faces in the crowd, even those now turned in anger against the elders, were the faces of those who had watched her be lowered into the earth. Their revolution was born of self-interest and freshly stoked rage, not of repentance for her. She could not walk among them. She could not be their symbol, their savior, their redeemed victim. The woman who could have done that had died in the dark, suffocated by soil and betrayal. The creature that had emerged was forged for this single, terrible purpose, and that purpose was now complete. The freedom she had clawed for, bled for, had been won. But it was a bitter, barren thing. It was the freedom of a ghost, to walk always on the outside, to look upon the world of the living from an unbridgeable distance. She was forever changed. The girl who loved her garden, who believed in choice, who dreamed of a future she, was a memory, a portrait painted in fading colors. What remained was the vessel, scarred by the earth and emptied of its vengeful spirits. She was free, but she was untethered. A star flung from its constellation into the cold, empty dark. The justice was hers, but the peace belonged to others. Turning her back on the chaos, on the smoking torches and the screaming, she took a step away from the burial ground, from the village, from the life that had been. Her freedom was a sentence of exile, and the wide, unknown world ahead was her new and lonely tomb. The silence within her was a new kind of tomb, vast and echoing. The chorus that had filled her mind for weeks, the sighs of the drowned, the fury of the walled up, the cold resolve of the betrayed was gone. The amulet at her chest, which had pulsed with their spectral energy, its etchings alive with a ghostly light, was now just a piece of dark, smooth stone. The warmth that had flowed from it, a comfort and a weapon in the deep dark, had faded completely, leaving it cold and inert against her skin. The connection was severed. The circuit of vengeance was complete. She stood on a rise overlooking the valley, the chaos of the village a distant, muted roar behind her, small as a disturbed anthill. The voices had not faded gradually. They had vanished between one heartbeat and the next, their purpose achieved, their collective will expended. The debt, centuries in the accruing, had been called in and paid in full. They had used her as their instrument, their vessel of retribution, and now that the last note of their symphony had been struck, they had departed, leaving behind only a profound, ringing silence. She was alone. Truly, utterly alone, for the first time since the first shovelful of earth had struck her face. The presence that had shared her mind, that had guided her hands and sharpened her senses, was absent. The cold clarity remained, but it was hers now, a permanent scar on her soul, not a borrowed power. She was a cup that had been filled to the brim with the poison of ancient wrongs, and now it was drained, leaving only the bitter residue. She looked down at the amulet, lifting it in her palm. It was just a rock, a family heirloom, a last gift from a weeping mother to a daughter she believed was doomed. Its magic, its terrible purpose, was spent. The light within it had dimmed and gone out forever, taking with it the whispers, the guidance, the constant humming pressure of other lives. The unavenged had found their peace, not in forgiveness, but in the cold, brutal balance of a justice long delayed, and she was left with the silence. It was heavier than the earth that had once buried her, more vast than the mountain sky above. She had become so accustomed to the counsel of ghosts in her head that their absence was a physical ache, a loneliness so complete it was dizzying. She had been a chorus, and now she was a single, stark note hanging in the void. The vengeance was theirs. The aftermath, the empty freedom, the endless silence that was hers, and hers alone. She stood under the cold stars, a monument to a finished war, the sole survivor on a field of battle where both sides had been erased. The silence was her only companion now, a vast and hollow expanse where the chorus of the unavenged had once resided. It was a heavier burden than any stone, a deeper solitude than any cave. Below, in the valley, the village was a wound of flickering torchlight and distant, fading shouts, a world tearing itself apart, a civilization devouring its own rotten heart. She had been the catalyst, the instrument of its unraveling, but she was no longer part of its story. Her work there was done. She turned her back on the lights, on the chaos, on the graves, and the ghosts. The path ahead was not a path at all, but a wild, trackless ascent into the deeper darkness of the mountains. She did not look back. There was nothing left for her. There no home, no family, no future. The girl who had belonged to that place was buried, and the woman who had risen was a creature of a different making, shaped by earth and vengeance, and now profoundly, irrevocably alone. She walked. Her steps were steady, purposeful, though they led nowhere she knew. The ragged burial shroud whispered against the cold stone, a faint sound in the immense quiet of the night. The air grew thinner, sharper, scoured clean by the high-altitude winds. Below and behind her, the world of men diminished, its noises fading into the sigh of the wind, its lights shrinking to insignificant sparks against the overwhelming dark. She was not fleeing. There was no longer anything to flee from, or was she seeking? There was nothing left to seek. This was a departure, a final, absolute severance. She moved through the landscape not as a victim, not as a fugitive, but as a force that had expended its purpose and was now returning to the wild from which all power ultimately springs. The mountains did not welcome her, but they did not reject her. Their indifference was a form of grace. Her name would not be forgotten in the valley below. It would be woven into their new foundation myths, a cautionary tale told to frighten children and warn against injustice. She would be the buried woman who walked, the vengeful spirit who brought down a chieftain, the price paid for corruption. She was a legend and a warning, a story they would tell for generations. But the woman herself was gone, leaving only the echo of her passage. The dawn found her high on a barren ridge, the first bloody rays of the sun staining the peaks around her. She paused, looking out over a sea of stone and cloud. The world was immense, ancient, and utterly unconcerned with the petty dramas of the valley. A strange peace settled over her, cold and clear as mountain ice. It was not happiness, nor was it sorrow. It was the quiet of a storm that has passed, leaving behind a landscape forever changed. She had no destination. The unknown was not a wilderness to be conquered, but a state of being to be inhabited. She was the unknown. With the sun warming her face and the endless sky above, she continued her walk, not into the sunset, but into the dawn, a solitary figure against the immensity of the world, becoming one with the silence and the stone. Years later, when the first snows dusted, the high peaks and the wind carried the bite of coming winter, the story was told. It did not fade into the realm of half-remembered myth or whispered superstition, as so many tales do. Instead, it was carved into the very soul of the village, a permanent scar and a solemn oath. It was told not in the great hall, which had been rebuilt under a new, cautious council, but in the quiet warmth of humble cottages. By the light of a single candle, two wide-eyed children who would one day bear the weight of its lesson. The story began not with a cruel suitor or a stern father, but with the earth itself. It spoke of the price of injustice, a currency paid not in gold or grain, but in peace and stability.
Elders
Of the new order, men and women who had witnessed the cataclysm, or grown up in its long shadow, wielded the tale as a sacred text. They spoke of the buried woman not as a monster, but as a consequence. Her defiance was not celebrated, but it was understood a desperate, human spark against the suffocating weight of unchecked power. Her return was not a paranormal event, but a seismic inevitability. The world righting a profound wrong through a vessel of stone and spirit. They told of the chieftain's fall, not as an accident, but as the crumbling of a rotten foundation. They spoke of Caius's end as the result of arrogance meeting its own reflection. The story was an intricate tapestry woven with threads of warning. This is what happens when fear governs instead of fairness. This is the ruin that pride brings. This is the ghost that injustice creates. And so, she was never forgotten. Her name, Alara, was spoken with a reverence that bordered on fear. A reminder that the earth has a long memory, and the silenced have a way of being heard. The old burial ground, once a place of dread, was allowed to be reclaimed by wildflowers and soft grasses, a quiet memorial to the price that had been paid there. No one was ever sentenced to such a fate again. The law itself was rewritten, its harshest edges softened by the cold, sharp lesson of the past. Her legacy was a village forever altered, living in the long, cold shadow of a story they were determined never to repeat. She became a permanent part of the landscape, a spirit of the mountains, and a guardian of the downtrodden. The tale of the buried woman who returned ensured that her name and the power of her defiance would echo through the generations. A caution carved not on stone, but on the heart of every soul who heard it.